The next bill on the calendar for today is Senate File 888. The clerk will report the bill.
Senate File number 888, number 2 on the calendar for the day, an act relating to the operation of state government, the unofficial engrossment.
I recognize the bill author, the member from Hennepin, Representative Anderson, to introduce your bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, members. I'm proud to present the state government finance bill today. Folks, we've heard from Governor Dayton that he is interested in enacting real reform here in the state level in this cycle of his governorship, and I couldn't agree more. We do need to enact real reform, but I think when it comes to real reform, we as a state government need to lead the way and show leadership, and so my bill does just that. Folks, my bill provides healthier options, eating options for families, financial literacy, and it also offers some learning opportunities for at-risk youth. This bill also prioritizes vets' health care and provides greater oversight of tax dollars. We've seen over the last 2 years that government spending has increased by 12 to 15%. Folks, that's just an unsustainable rate. What this bill attempts to do is try to provide greater oversight, greater accountability of our tax dollars, and just more effective and accountable government to our public citizens. So with that, members, I stand for questions and look forward to the amendments. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
There is an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Anderson S. moves to amend Senate File number 888, the unofficial engrossment, and the amendment is coded A8.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Anderson, to introduce your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This provision, all it does is it deletes a section that's relating to the Office of the Legislative Auditor and their audit data, and that's all it does. I'd ask for your support.
Any discussion on the amendment? Seeing no discussion on the amendment, all those in favor of adoption signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The motion prevails and the amendment is adopted. There is another amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Khan moves to amend Senate File 888, the unofficial engrossment, as amended, and the amendment is coded A11.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Khan, to explain your amendment.
Too much paper. Just a minute, Mr. Chairman. Oh, Mr. Chairman and members of the House, I'd move adoption of the amendment, and I'd also call for a roll call vote.
A roll call has been requested. Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call.
Okay.
Representative Khan.
Mr. Speaker and members, this is part of a continuing attempt to try and teach some elementary arithmetic on the floor of the House. What we have, let's start with a very simple question. If we have an amendment that says 1 plus 1 equals 2, an equation, sorry, 1 plus 1 equals 2, and we add an amendment to it that says 1 plus 1 plus 1, we then know that equals 2 plus 1. We can say it says 3 equals 3 if we want to do that. But if we say 1, we cannot say 1 plus 1 plus 1 still equals 2. This is what we're trying to do in our state budget. We have a line in the in our budgeting section. We have a line in our budgeting section which states that we cannot count inflation as we're doing the budget. We do not have anything, though, that puts any restrictions on the counting of inflation when we look at the revenues coming into the budget. That is as simple as saying that 1 plus 1 plus 1 equals 2, instead of adding the 1 on both sides, so you get 1 plus 1 plus 1 equals 3. I hope that's we've sometimes tried to, this concept of not counting inflation seems to be great because people jump up and scream, we're not putting government on autopilot and something. This is another attempt to just have an equation that makes sense in our statute books. We do not want to have the equivalent which we have now of 1 + 1 + 1 = 2. In this case, we just simply say if expenditure estimates do not include an allowance for inflation, revenue estimates must not include an allowance for inflation. That's the equivalent of adding 1 to both sides, and I hope that the author of the bill will accept it.
Discussion on the Khan amendment. The member from Sherburne, Representative Knobloch.
Well, Mr. Speaker, Representative Khan, I'm actually really glad you brought this amendment because this has been an issue that's been around for years. I am kind of surprised in one sense, though, to hear you bring in the amendment because, as you know, I've been gone the last several years, and it was an issue before I left, and I didn't necessarily expect it would be an issue when I came back because the Democrats had control of the House and the Senate and the governorship these last 2 years. And I remember when I left, there was always all sorts of criticism about why we weren't doing this and how, well, it was because Governor Pawlenty didn't want it. But here I come back, and what do I find? After 2 years of complete DFL control, nothing has changed. If this was such an important issue, if this was something that was such a good idea, why didn't your side go ahead and do something about it the last 2 years? But I'm not going to necessarily ask you to yield on that. I will say, members, this is actually a lot more complicated than it looks. And Mr. Speaker, I'd actually like to ask Representative Khan to yield for a couple questions if I could.
She will yield. Representative Knobloch.
Well, Representative Khan, in your bill or your amendment, rather, you say revenue estimates must not include an allowance for inflation. Representative Khan, do all revenue estimates currently include an allowance for inflation?
Representative Khan.
Mr. Speaker, Representative Knobloch, yes, I'll give you a specific example. What happens is that when we look at tax collections, we look at estimated salaries. All of those estimated salaries have an estimate for inflation in. And while I'm up, Mr. Speaker, if I can answer your previous question, one, I have introduced the bill to get rid of that line, which was put in by 2 old friends of ours. That was a Krinky-Pogomilla agreement. So I think that probably tells everyone what might have been wrong with it. But I have tried it every year that I was here. What I was waiting for, Representative Knobloch, is for as sensible a chair of Ways and Means as you to come back so that you will clearly agree with me and accept it, and we can get rid of it together.
Well, Mr. Speaker, would Representative Khan yield for another question?
She will yield. Representative Knobloch.
Well, Representative Khan, you didn't answer my first question about whether all current revenue estimates in the forecast include inflation. I guess let me talk about expenditures, Representative Khan. Mr. Speaker, Representative Khan, is it true that none of the current expenditure estimates in the forecast include inflation?
Representative Khan.
Mr. Speaker, if they do, they are in violation of the statute, because the statute specifically says they shall not include an estimate for inflation. So assuming that they're following the law, then we specifically know that they do not. This puts the same language in on the other side of the equation. If we're not doing it right on one side, then we're probably not going to do it right on the other side, and all we have to do is get rid of, when you get to conference committee, you can get rid of all of those silly lines, which you seem to agree with me on. And as I said, all I was doing was waiting for you to get back and come in charge.
Representative Knobloch.
Well, Mr. Speaker, members, when we hear about the budget forecast, and we hear now that we have a budget surplus of $1.9 billion, I think people here know, I'm not sure if everyone who might be watching on TV knows this, we don't have $1.9 billion sitting in the bank. This is $1.9 billion that our state economist projects is going to be in the state's bank account on June 30th, 2017, when the next budget period ends. And so the state economist is making this forecast, members. And how does the state economist do that? What they do is they look at current law. They look at the way the law is now, and they say, if the law doesn't change, this is my estimate of where we'll be at the end of the next biennium, in this case, June 30th, 2017. Our state economist's best guess is then we'll have a surplus of $1.9 billion. But let's first talk about revenues, members, because actually it is not true that inflation is included in the revenue forecast. Look at the state income tax, for example. The state income tax, which comprises about half of the general fund revenues for this state, has actually been adjusted for inflation for something like 30 years. You go back 30-some years in the high inflation years, and I don't remember exactly when this came in, but in the high inflation years of the 70s and 80s, what was happening is people would get an inflationary increase, but because inflation was so high, it was evident that they were quickly moving into higher tax brackets, even though they, in a sense, really weren't making any additional money. And so we changed it, members, so that actually now the Department of Revenue adjusts their income tax tables to adjust for inflation. So, members, actually about half of the general fund actually doesn't have inflation in it. It probably starts out with it, but we effectively take it out when the state economist does the forecast. Then you look at some other segments of revenue we have. Now, the sales tax is about 25% of our general fund revenues. That, I would guess, when they're making their estimate, if there's inflation, we get more sales tax, and so that has inflation built into it, just because that's how the sales tax is calculated. But you look at some of the other revenues that we have, the estate tax, I don't know that that really has any bearing on inflation and how that goes up. It's probably more tied to the stock market. Commercial real estate values, you know, a few years ago, inflation was probably flat and commercial real estate values were going down. So, members, it is a myth that we have inflation figured into the revenues. In a few cases we do, like the sales tax, but all we're doing is following current law. And members, on the expenditure side, it's the same thing. You look at special education, the second largest line item in the education budget, we have an automatic inflator there of 4.6% per year, that in our budget it automatically goes up 4.6% a year unless we change it. Also in the education area, we have an automatic inflator in the adult basic education area. I think it's 3% a year. You look at medical assistance, the largest single line item of expenditure in the state budget. If you count the federal funds, we do forecast inflation in the medical assistance budget. And so, members, again, if you look at expenditures, there are some where we are forecasting inflation. If you look at the budget forecast, there are some that we are not. Yes, under the law, as Representative Kahn says, we're not automatically adding inflation to everything, but I hope, members, you're understanding that it's much more complicated than Representative Kahn is portraying. Much, much more complicated. And members, I would ask you to vote down the amendment, because I think the way it is now, basically what we have, the forecast, is our baseline. The economist, our state economist, looks at the economy. She makes her estimates based on what the law is. If we change the law, then we can say, well, the effect of this law is going to perhaps decrease revenues, perhaps increase revenues. But members, if you want to change the forecast and add inflation, then bring forward a bill to add inflation to various expenditures, or to take inflation out of some of the other revenues. Members, Speakers, I think it's right for us to just stick with the way the state economist has been doing it for years, and I'd ask that you vote no on the Khan amendment.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Thiessen.
Mr. Speaker, the state economist...
Representative Khan. Representative Thiessen has the floor. Representative Thiessen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Always dangerous to interrupt Representative Khan, but well, and I really appreciate the soliloquy and lecture, Representative Knobloch, on how our forecast works. Just a couple things that I'd point out. Because of your deep concern about, balancing the books and how all this forecasting works, members, I mean, if you look at your tax bill as an example, and this is coming off the remark you made that this is not really cash in the bank, it's just what's forecasted into the future. In a tax bill that you are going to be moving, I guess, passed out of Ways and Means today, if you were to phase in everything that's in that tax bill in the year 2016 and 17 and the upcoming biennium, it would be a $4.5 billion reduction in revenues. You'd create a $2.5 billion deficit in this upcoming biennium if you actually put it all into law right now. You're trying to hide it from the people of Minnesota. I get that. But that's not good budgeting, Representative Knobloch. You're ignoring, I guess, inflation right there, but that's ridiculous. And it's irresponsible. In your press conference today on the education bill, you claim that you're putting in another $1 billion, which is also ridiculous. If you ask any teacher, if you ask any superintendent, if you ask anyone related to schools in Minnesota, they'll know that you're not telling the truth about that. Because what we have in there is pupil growth worth $250 million. What they have in there is the fact that we put in funding for the second year of the biennium that is now going to be 2 years of the biennium. Not an increase in funding. It's just double because we started it in the second year of the biennium. So the problem I have with you getting up and lecturing us about the budget and the forecast, Representative Knobloch, is because you're doing the most irresponsible budgeting we have ever seen in this body. And you should be ashamed of how you're doing this. Borrowing all kinds of funds. The bill we just voted on, Representative McNamara's bill, in a time of surplus, he's borrowing all kinds of money. In the bill we're debating tonight, to reach her target, Representative Anderson is maybe cutting about $18 million, and she's shifting about $60 million. That's the kind of reform, I guess, Representative Anderson believes in. But you should be ashamed of your budgeting. But worst of all, in the bill that we're facing tonight, because we're talking about a lot of technical stuff here, worst of all in the bill you're facing tonight is you are blowing a Koch brothers hole in our democracy. This bill will allow us to spend as much as we want on our campaigns. There will be no limitation on what we can spend on our campaigns. It will allow us to solely rely on PACs and lobbyists to fund our campaign. So we can spend $200,000 and we can raise all that money from PACs and lobbyists, from corporate special interests. And we're cutting out the ability of individual people to participate in our democracy. That, we can talk all day about the importance and the policy issues around Representative Khan's amendment here, but that is outrageous and shameful.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Khan.
Mr. Speaker and members, the simple line that exists in state law says that expenditure estimates must not include an allowance for inflation. What that is doing is subtracting something. Now, I don't care how the state economist works it and how she figures around it, but our law has a mathematically incorrect equation in it. And I believe our duty here, if we believe in something like an adherence, not to the law of God, but just to the rules of simple arithmetic, mean that today we have a chance to correct this equation and to say that 1 + 1 = 2 and 1 + 1 + 1 = 3. That's all I'm asking you to do today. If you believe that statement is correct, you will vote for my amendment.
Further discussion on the Khan amendment. Who's got it? Oh. The member from Hennepin, Representative Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would Representative Dean yield to a question?
Which Representative Dean?
That one.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Dean R. He will yield. I'm sorry, Representative Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Dean. Or, excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Dean, can you tell me how much you received in public subsidy last election cycle?
Representative Dean.
Boy, Mr. Speaker and Representative Anderson, I don't have my charts with me, but I would say that I received somewhere in the neighborhood of $4,200 to maybe $4,800.
Representative Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll help you out, Representative Dean. You received $7,091. Representative Pinto, would you yield for a question?
He will yield. Representative Anderson.
Representative Pinto, can you tell me how much you received in public subsidy?
Representative Pinto.
Mr. Speaker, Representative Anderson, you know, I don't know. I'm thinking it may be around that same amount. I know that my Republican opponent, I believe, received a similar amount, and I think contributed it to the state party, is my understanding. Thank you for asking.
Representative Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Pinto, you received $8,567. And of that amount, you donated $8,000 to the House DFL caucus, as Representative Dean donated $7,000 out of his $7,091 to the DFL caucus. That's tax dollars. Those are the dollars that the citizens of the state of Minnesota gave to them for their campaigns. I'm guessing you probably won by around 60%, maybe, right? 62, maybe more than that, right? And we're spending tax dollars so that you can shift the money to the House DFL caucus. Now, I don't blame you. You want to give that money to your DFL caucus, that's fine. But should we be using public
Parliamentary
tax
inquiry,
dollars
Mr.
for
Speaker?
public subsidy?
Parliamentary inquiry, Mr. Speaker?
Representative Winkler, for what purpose do you rise?
Under what order of business are we right now?
We are debating the Khan amendment, the A11 amendment. Representative Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I apologize. I'm just building my base and responding to Representative Thiessen's comments. Folks, when we're talking about public subsidy, we're talking about the people's money. What we're doing in this bill is say we are no longer going to take the people's money and spend it on politicians' campaigns. Members on the Khan amendment, I urge you to vote no.
Any further discussion on the Khan amendment? Representative Pinto.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I guess I'll save my comments on that till to the point that Representative Anderson made till later. I just want to point out that the Council of Economic Advisors here in our state has said that Minnesota's current practice of excluding inflation from the spending estimate is fundamentally misleading. It is inconsistent with sound business practices. I have to say that that finding is consistent with my understanding as well. I'm not aware of businesses that would count inflation on one side of a ledger, not on the other. I understand Chair Knobloch's point about this being complicated, but when I look at the statute, it seems pretty clear. Revenue must be estimated from all sources provided for in current law. Expenditures must be estimated for all obligations imposed by law. And for some reason, a number of years ago, we took inflation off of one side of the ledger and added in the other. So I would urge a passage of the amendment, and I'll respond to the rest later. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Khan.
Mr. Speaker, I then revert to my primary characterization of this amendment. If you believe that 1 + 1 + 1 equals 3, you should vote for my amendment. If you believe that 1 + 1 + 1 equals 2, then vote against my amendment and go explain that to your kids taking arithmetic when you get home.
The member from Sherburne, Representative Knobloch.
Well, just briefly, members, I just want everyone to know, if you don't, that the budget forecast always contains an estimate from the state economist of what the actual surplus or deficit would be if we counted fully inflation on both the expenditure and the revenue side. And Representative Kahn, you say, well, look, this is what the law says. But yes, Representative Kahn, the law also says that we take inflation out of the income tax numbers. The law also says that we count inflation in medical assistance expenditures. The law also says that we count inflation, in fact, more than inflation, in special education and adult basic education. So members, again, it's all much more complicated than is being portrayed. Again, I would urge you to keep things the way they are so that current law, whatever that may be, is what governs how we determine our forecast.
Representative Pinto.
Thank you. I just want to say that if MMB is already producing this number, then despite the complexity, it should be pretty simple to implement this. We can simply follow the number that MMB is providing. Businesswomen and men know that they do this in their own businesses. If we're going to treat government like a business, then please vote green.
Seeing no further discussion, the clerk will take the roll on the amendment. The clerk will close the roll. There being 53 ayes and 76 nays, the motion does not prevail and the amendment is not adopted. There is an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Nelson moved to amend Senate File Number 888, the unofficial engrossment as amended, and the amendment is coded A26.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Nelson, to explain your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. And members, what this amendment does is realize the large number of cuts that are in this bill to all parts of state government. And what this does is just gets at a little piece of that. Now, members, when we make cuts like this, it means that our people are going to get laid off and are going to be let go. And so when people get let go in state government, we have to pay severance. And in past years, we've heard up to $30,000 for each person that gets let go in severance costs. That includes unemployment insurance, that includes paying them off for their unused vacation time, paying partially off for their unused sick time. And that's on average, what we've been told in the past years when we've done this, had layoffs, it costs about $30,000 per employee. Now the Department of Admin says in this bill, the way it's structured, that they're going to have to on the current thing, they're going to have to lose 16 full-time equivalents. That's 16 employees. And they say also, on top of those cuts, with the changes of responsibility that they're having and the additional stuff being put on them, that the current employees they have don't have the skills that they need to do that. So there may be an additional 30 cuts with 30 new hires to adjust their staff properly so that they have the right mix of people so that they're right size to do the jobs that the bill is imposing upon them in the Department of Admin. And I've gotten a letter from the Department of the Veterans Affairs. They're saying with the cuts that are in this bill, they're looking at maybe losing 88 positions. So that's 88 people. So this bill, this amendment just slightly goes at that. Now we've nicked a little every other parts of the bill a little bit to try and come up with a little bit of money so that there's money in there to pay for this severance costs. Because members, if we don't pay for it, that means that they're going to have to lay off additional people to pay for that. So it's that those 16 people they're laying off at basically half of what it costs to have an employee on full time for the year. It means they're going to have to lay off probably another 8 people. So this is what we're looking at, is a large amount of money that's going to be caused by the layoffs we have here. So this is what it's trying to be honest about our accounting, honest about our budgeting. If we're going to do a cut bill, we need to account for those costs that we're imposing upon our state government, our state employees, and our departments, so that they can fund these things, so they can do the things that they need to do. And members, that's what this is all about. It's about honesty in budgeting. It's about, as Representative Kahn said in the early amendment, about 1 + 1 + 1 = 3, about being honest about how we're doing this. And members, I know what the numbers are, and I know how it looks, how the votes are going to go. And because of that, I wanted to speak on this, because it's important that we understand that when we're doing cut budgets, and these are, I mean, this budget is all about shifts. This bill is all about shifts and gimmicks. And members, sometimes when we're in a deficit, shifts make sense. We can get over a short-term deficit to keep programs going and keep employees on, to do the business of the state of Minnesota. But members, we have a $2 billion surplus. And to be doing these shifts and gimmicks that we did when we had deficits doesn't make sense at this time. And so members, at this time I'm going to pull the amendment.
Representative Nelson withdraws the A26 amendment. There is an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Norton moves to amend Senate File Number 888, the unofficial engrossment as amended. The amendment is coded RA 15-010.
The member from Olmsted, Representative Norton, to explain your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have before you an amendment that modifies a provision in the bill dealing with the councils, our minority councils in the state of Minnesota. I've been approached by 2 different councils, but in particular CLAC, the Chicano Latino Affairs Council, about some concerns they had with the provision. First, I want to thank Representative Lane for taking on this issue and seeking to address the concerns that were identified in the OLA report. I think that was very important. And I think there's agreement that improvements could and should be made, and in fact have been made, on the ethnic councils since the OLA report was released. In my community, both CLAC and the Council of Black Minnesotans are active and have made impressive changes in the last 2 years in visibility, in their actions, and in being a voice for their respective communities at the school, at the city council, and at the county board levels. My amendment puts a short pause on implementing Representative Lane's proposal and gives the 3 councils a short period of time through a task force to discuss the proposed changes in law, to allow for some debate and understanding. Representative Lane has a lot of experience in mediation, and it was my hope that through that pause that everyone could come together and hopefully agree with the recommendations that she had, but if not, to suggest some changes that could be made next session. Members, we all want to be heard. We don't want things done to us. We want things done with us. And that's what my amendment was trying to do. So, members, I'm just going to let you know that I had a number of people who I've been working with or who've worked on this issue: Representative Dean, Representative Keel, Representative Mariani, Clark, Liebling, Nelson, Kahn, and Hamilton. We've all been very interested in trying to make some changes to Representative Lane's language, but really I think what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to withdraw this amendment and ask that as this bill moves into conference committee, that continued work can be done to make some modifications so that all the councils can come together and move ahead making the changes, hopefully, that Representative Lane has suggested, but if not those changes, some modifications that will benefit us all. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to withdraw the A10, A010 amendment and hope for some changes in conference committee.
Representative Norton withdraws the amendment coded RA 15-010. There is another amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Schultz moves to amend Senate File 888, the unofficial engrossment as amended, and the amendment is coded A35.
To your amendment, the lady from St. Louis, Representative Schultz.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This amendment addresses legislative redistricting. So for the last 40 years, the legislature and the governor have never agreed on a new map, except for 1991 when Arnie Carlson failed to veto. This amendment is based on the bipartisan coalition, including Mondale and Carlson, and they have urged this body to take the politics out of redistricting. This bill proposes a 5-member commission of retired judges with no party endorsements. We currently draw our own lines, which I think creates a conflict of interest. It's like allowing the winning team to set the rules of the game. Incumbents are able to pick their own voters, leading to more partisanship and lack of competition for a seat. And given our prior discussion, which Representative Anderson pointed out, that many members here win by a large percentage of votes, it leads to more or strengthening of partisan extremes and a loss of moderate voices in this body. Only about 1/3 of Minnesota legislative districts are competitive, according to Larry Jacobs. This bill is being passed in the Senate with bipartisan support. It's been endorsed by the Secretary of State, Steve Simon, and it's been endorsed in the past by Roger Moe, former President George W. Bush, the League of Women Voters, Minnesota Chamber of Commerce, the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits, Take Action, and Common Cause of Minnesota. I urge you to support this amendment and vote green. We need more cooperation in this body. We need to take this redistricting out of our hands and into the hands of people who are not partisan, who have no conflicts of interest. As Arnie Carlson once said, you can't take the politics out of the politics, but at least you can minimize it. Thank you. I please urge you to vote green. I roll call it.
Discussion to the A35 amendment. Chair Anderson. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Point of order.
Please state your point of order.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to House Rule 4.03, item H. This amendment is out of order. It spends money and has no way of paying for it, and so it violates our budget resolution.
Advice to the Speaker. Advice to the Speaker.
Mr. Speaker?
Advice?
Advice, Mr. Speaker. I do not believe this bill will spend money.
Advice, Mr. Speaker.
Chair Anderson, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, if you look at the amendment and you look at lines, page 3, line 14, it has compensation and expenses. So members of the commission must be compensated for their commission activity as provided in section 15.05, but there is no appropriation to provide for that compensation. Therefore, it violates Rule 4.03, section H, and it doesn't account for the budget resolution, violates the budget resolution.
Advice, the gentleman from Hennepin, Leader Thiessen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, as you may know, and I know Representative Anderson knows, under the current system, We allocate a substantial amount of money to hire staff for each of the caucuses, each of the 4 caucuses, to buy computers for each of the 4 caucuses, printers to do the redistricting maps for each of the 4 caucuses. That's money that wouldn't need to be spent if Representative Schultz's proposal goes forward. So I would say we're going to be saving significant amount of money that we would spend on ourselves with this amendment, and will be, to the extent that we are going to be spending money for this commission, it would be going in that direction. As you know, this House, Representative Anderson took her committee out on the road all across the state of Minnesota to take testimony when we did the redistricting the last time. That costs a lot of money. Mr. Speaker, I would advise you to find the point of order not well taken, and that we proceed with Representative Schultz's motion, amendment.
Thank you, Leader Thiessen. The gentleman from Rice, Representative Bly.
Advice. This is redistricting that would follow the next census. I don't think it's in this biennium that it would be paid for anyway. So certainly in future redistrictings, we can find a way to budget the money for it, but it doesn't affect this budget.
Thank you. The lady from St. Louis, Representative Schultz.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Advice?
State your advice.
So this was a bill that did not get a hearing in the State Government Finance Committee, so I did not request a fiscal note.
Further advice? Thank you, members.
Mr. Speaker, further advice?
Please state your further advice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I apologize. I think you just didn't see me before, and I did want to let you know that, because kind of following on what Representative Bly was saying, because this wouldn't be in effect yet, and because we have no tails target, this would, whatever cost this might have, is not going to take effect until sometime in the future. Therefore, it does not violate the current budget target. So, Mr. Speaker, you should find the point of order not well taken.
Further advice?
Advice, Mr. Speaker.
The lady from Hennepin, Representative Anderson S.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This, in the language just below the compensation expenses in subdivision 4, it says that this comes out of the LCC budget and that they must provide administrative support. And so this commission would be established. They could be working as soon as this gets enacted into law, which would, in effect, affect our budget target resolution and cost the state money. So this is out of order.
Further advice? The gentleman from Ramsey, Representative Pinto.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I direct your attention to line 2.31, which indicates the commission will be appointed by March 1st of each year ending in 1. The next year ending in 1 is 2021, which is beyond the time period that the bill relates to. Therefore, it cannot add, it wouldn't be adding cost because the commission wouldn't be appointed until the budget period is over. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker.
Advice? The lady from Hennepin, Representative Lincheski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Further advice? Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Advice to the body. Members, as has just been walked through by a number of members, this is a bill, this is an amendment that is affecting something far out in the future. And Mr. Speaker, if you rule that under 4.03 that this amendment is out of order, you must, going forward, rule that a number of the omnibus bills are out of order. There are numerous omnibus bills that have provisions that cost hundreds of millions of dollars outside of the forecast window. This is significantly outside the forecast window, and I hope you will rule the point not well taken.
Further advice?
Mr. Speaker.
For what purpose does the lady rise?
I'm going to withdraw my point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Okay.
And I'd like to speak to the amendment, Mr. Speaker.
Okay, Chair Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I rise in opposition to this amendment. I have studied the issue of redistricting for quite some time, having been the redistricting chair in the last go-around. And when people talk about a commission solving all our ills and woes when it comes to redistricting, I ask them to look to other states that have commissions. You are not going to get out the partisanship. You're not going to eliminate a hanky-panky when it comes to redistricting. In fact, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be leaving up redistricting to people that don't understand the districts. You can't tell me that there isn't a single person in this room that doesn't know their legislative territory better than anyone else. We door knock, we meet with our constituents, we're with our thought leaders constantly. That's why we cannot abdicate our responsibility to draw redistricting plans. In fact, that very situation is happening right now in the U.S. Supreme Court, talking about the fact that we cannot abdicate our responsibility to draw the legislative lines. Folks, the commission is not the approach to take. I urge you to vote red, and I ask for a roll call, Mr. Speaker.
Roll call having been requested. Are there 15 hands? Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. Discussion to the amendment. The lady from Olmsted, Representative Liebling.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And members, well, this really strikes me as being very similar to the situation where we set our own pay. Members, we should not be deciding on our own redistricting. We should not. I did get to see this process play out at least once since I was elected. And lots of my constituents kept asking me, why don't we have an independent commission doing this? Why are you doing this? It became the most partisan of partisan activities. Members, we don't need it. We don't need to be deciding on our own lines. We don't need to be deciding on our own redistricting. This is the very thing that we should not do. Doing this is the height of self-interest. This should be about our constituents. It should be about having fair districts. It should be about having competitive elections. And I think that passing this amendment and enacting this commission, this would be healthy for our state. It would be one of the healthiest things we could do for our state, and it would be showing our constituents that we care more about them than we do about ourselves and our own continuing in office. This should not be something that legislators decide. So I hope that you will vote yes on this amendment.
The gentleman from Ramsey, Representative Isaacson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In response to Representative Anderson, I'm trying to think of a time in which we ended up being the deciders of this. It goes to court. It goes to court because we fight about it in politics, and in court, they're the ones that are deciding. So we don't end up deciding anyways. So in my opinion, I'm not sure I follow your logic on that. Thank you.
Lady from St. Louis, Representative Schultz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Speaker. I urge you to vote yes on this, vote green. Right now, if we draw our own districts, it's too self-serving. We need to take this out of our hands. We still have the ability to vote once it goes to the commission and comes back. And if we're not satisfied, it will go back and get redrafted. And the governor will get to weigh in as well. So I urge you to vote green on this amendment. Thank you. And I would like, oh no, roll calls are already now.
There is a roll call. The gentleman from Hennepin, Leader Thiessen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like a call of the House.
Call of the House. Seeing 10 hands, there will be a call of the House. Please take. Clerk will take the roll. The clerk will close the roll. Discussion to the Schultz Amendment. The clerk will take the roll. Members, the House is under call. The clerk will close the roll. There being 52 ayes and 77 nays, the motion is con changes from aye to nay. From nay to aye. There being 53 ayes and 76 nays, the motion is not adopted. Was that right? Okay. There's an amendment to the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Murphy E. moves to amend Senate File Number 888, the unofficial engrossment as amended, and the amendment is coded A34.
Yeah.
Okay, before we go to the amendment, I'm going to recognize the gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Thiessen. For what purpose you rise?
Mr. Speaker, I'd move that we let the call of the House.
Speaker Thiessen moves that we remove the call of the House. All in favor say aye. Opposed? Motion prevails. Members, we now have before us the A34 amendment. To your amendment, Representative Murphy E.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I would ask for your support for the A34 amendment. 11 months ago, not even a full year ago, we passed the Health Insurance Transparency Act. After 9 years of effort in trying to pass a school pool bill that had been passed by the legislature and vetoed a couple of times by Governor Pawlenty, We took a different path and created legislation to create a competitive bidding process to drive down healthcare costs for school employees and to deliver a better value to taxpayers. We had quite a debate about this last year, but at the end of the process, we had solid bipartisan support for this piece of legislation, including my conference committee partner, Representative Davids, right now Speaker Davids, and the laws came into place. The ink is barely dry on this piece of legislation, and it is beginning to work in the state of Minnesota. There are a number of school districts who have begun the process of negotiating with a competitive process to get a better deal and a better value on their health insurance. And that's a good thing for school employees. It's certainly a good thing for property taxpayers. And I am hopeful that as we enter into the summer, and you can see if you talk with school districts, that many of the school contracts and their health insurance contracts will be negotiated this summer. So the law is new, it is underway, but it has not really been all that tested yet. I know that there were a couple of informational hearings on this piece of legislation, or not this legislation, on the law, one in Chair Anderson's committee, one in Chair Loon's committee. I did attend part of the informational hearing in Chair Loon's committee at the very early part of the session. And I heard some concerns expressed there, but nothing terribly specific. I did reach out to folks from the Minnesota Rural Education Association and from the co-ops to talk with them about their concerns. And after a long conversation about where we were with the law, we agreed that we wouldn't proceed this year with a change to this law because it was barely underway. I mean, really, just 6 months underway. It's a new law. And I agreed that if after a year, after we go through this full year of negotiation, if there are issues that have emerged as a result of the implementation of the law, that I would, in good faith, take that up with them to see what we could do to fix that. And I'd heard that there was a bill that was being introduced, but then I understand that that didn't happen, and that there was no further action on this issue, and in fact, no hearing in state government finance. So I would ask tonight for your support for this amendment that strips out just one provision of that new law. And I would ask you to do that for a couple of reasons. One, the law is new. It's beginning to work. I have some information about the districts that have already begun to implement this. So in Underwood, Minnesota, that school district sought 5 bids on their health insurance. They received 3. And they changed carriers. They went to Medica and they decreased their costs. In Henning, they sought bids. They chose the same carrier at the end. They stuck with theirs, but they got a lower cost. They got a lower rate. Same thing in Foston. And in fact, after the bidding process and the negotiation, because there's a negotiation that goes with that process, they saw a 15% decrease in their health insurance costs. I think there's a lot of promise in this law. I think that's why so many Democrats and Republicans voted for it. We know what we're seeing in the administration with competitive bidding. I think we should let this law work, and if we take this chunk out, we'll begin to unravel what was a hard-fought compromise before we've really been able to bear the fruit of that good work. So I would ask respectfully for your vote on the A34 amendment to keep the law in place as it is, and I'd request a roll call. Thank you.
Roll call. Having requested are the 15 hands. Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. The lady from Hennepin, Chair Anderson S.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Representative Murphy. You've talked about the importance of having competitive bid process. This just makes it that PEEP is part of that competitive bid process, and that school districts that are part of PEEP are competing for bids that way too, so that they can find the lowest cost bid. So I would urge you to vote no on this amendment.
Further discussion? The clerk will take the roll. Members, please vote. The clerk will close the roll. There being 56 ayes and 73 nays, the motion does not prevail. There's an amendment to the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Fisher moves to amend Senate File Number 888, the unofficial engrossment as amended, and the amendment is coded A14.
The gentleman from Ramsey, Representative Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I'd like to ask for a roll call on this.
Roll call having requested. Are there 15 hands? Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. The gentleman from Ramsey, Representative Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Basically, what this amendment does is allows the Legislative Water Commission to continue on until its sunset date in 4 years. This is an important commission that's getting off the ground doing the important work on a very complicated issue. It's very bipartisan, and it's also bicameral. We've had many water issues that that have come before the legislature this year. We have more that are coming up down the road in the future, and we see that this is great. This is going to be a great venue to help have some of the broader discussions based on the science that is out there and provide the expertise within both bodies to be able to help guide us with better legislation. And we're already seeing some of the results of that. Is in one of our earlier bills this evening was making reference that as one of the reports would, for our water supply group, be having some of the reports come to the legislature with recommendations and input to make sure that as future statutes are being looked at or referred to, is make sure that we don't have unintended consequences. So this would be a way to keep a good commission up and running and let it do some great work that we need with all the water issues that we have from all corners of our state.
Discussion. The lady from Hennepin, Chair Anderson S.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, or Mr. Speaker, and members. This commission basically has spent over a year doing what we do in the first 2 weeks of session. I encourage you to vote no.
Discussion. The gentleman from Nicollet, Representative Johnson C.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Mr. Speaker, and I am a member of the Legislative Water Commission, and I asked for a seat on that commission because water is a remarkably complex issue. We've got issues with water quality, we've got issues with water quantity. And when I think about it, the issues vary by region radically, from the sands of Hubbard County to the situation in southwest Minnesota to the waters of the Minnesota River. There's just different challenges, and then you go to White Bear Lake and on and so forth. What the commission does is it provides multiple ways to look at it, and there's lots of legislation before the House. What we need as a legislature is to understand this complexity, and frankly, I think we really need a larger view, a focus on the concept of water and a larger view at looking in a multidimensional way. One of my frustrations, frankly, with the House is too often we take a narrow view, and it's kind of the nature of the process. The Legislative Water Commission is able to take the broader view. We just got started. It just got started. We started in the start of this session, and with the busyness of the session, we were able to start to learn more about it. And this is what I talked about earlier. You'll recall I talked about some of the successes in this state. That's where we're learning about the successes in this state. Those are the successes that we seek to learn from and seek to be able to replicate in other parts of the state. Minnesota wants clean water, folks, and the Legislative Water Commission is a spot that can help us create the legislation that will make that happen. So it's fundamentally important to all. Water is obviously fundamentally important to everybody in Minnesota, and it will be for generations to come. This is a valuable asset for the House and for the Senate and the legislature. It's a bipartisan, bicameral commission. Let's keep it there so we can make better policy related to water.
Discussion? Roll call having been requested, the clerk will take the roll. Clerk will close the roll. There being 57 ayes and 72 nays, the motion is not adopted. There's an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Nelson moved to amend Senate File Number 888, the unofficial engrossment as amended, and the amendment is coded A37.
The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker and members, the 837 amendments about transparency and contracting, part of this bill, there's a lot of, with cutting down some of the staff that we have on board, we're also contracting out more work. And with that, we should have some transparency in that. We should know what we're spending our money on. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion in the caucus, or excuse me, not in the caucus, in the committees, both the government operations and the state government finance, about what we're paying, about the raises the big kerfuffle about the raises with earlier in the year. All this stuff, we've had a lot of discussion about that in committee. And if we're going to contract out, we should have that same concern about what we're paying consultants to do the work for us, because that's also taxpayer dollars, and we shouldn't be paying them more. So I'd like a roll call, Mr. Speaker.
Roll call having a request. Are there 15 hands? Seeing 15 hands, there will be roll call.
And Mr. Speaker,
Nelson.
I have an amendment to the amendment, if we could.
There's an amendment to the amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment to the amendment.
Nelson moves to amend his amendment to Senate File Number 888, the unofficial engrossment, and the amendment to the amendment is coded A39.
To the amendment, Representative Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And could I start out with having a roll call on this?
Roll call being requested. Are there 15 hands? Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call on the amendment to the amendment.
And Mr. Speaker and members, this has to do with the hourly rate, the maximum hourly rate charged to state agencies for the work that are performed. I mean, currently, what I'm being told is some of the consultants we have out there that are currently working for the state, and in some of the areas that we're doing this, we're contracting this stuff out, that they make anywhere from $90 an hour to up to $250 an hour. Now, if you take $100 an hour for quick and easy math, at an average year, 40-hour work week, 52 weeks a year, you're talking at $100 an hour, you're talking $200,000 a year. Now, members, that's a lot more than we pay anyone that works for the state of Minnesota. I mean, when I'm told the highest line staff that we have out there, they're making $50 an hour. So, I mean, this is, even at the $90 or $100, we're talking twice as much as we're charging as what our own employees that work for the state of Minnesota make. And we're going to contract this out and pay people twice as much to do the work that we could do internally. And members, so I mean, I just think that we need to look at this as we go forward. If we're going to be doing this, we need to be looking at what we paying these people, because it's about transparency of what we pay these people, and that's why the amendment's brought forward. But Mr. Speaker, with that, I think I'm going to pull the original amendment and pull my amendment to the amendment.
The amendment to the amendment and the amendment have been withdrawn. There's an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment. And there's other amendments
there. Winkler moves to amend Senate File Number 888, the unofficial engrossment, as amended as follows, and the amendment is coded A44.
The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wonder if the clerk could report the amendment to the amendment, which would be the A50. I asked him.
We have an amendment to the amendment. The clerk will report the amendment to the amendment.
Garofalo moves to amend the Winkler amendment to Senate File 888, the unofficial engrossment as amended. The amendment to the amendment is coded A60.
The gentleman from Dakota, Representative Garofalo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This amendment to the amendment is pretty self-explanatory. It has that the auditor, we have that the auditor request to investigate the report of the percentage of union dues and fair share fees that are deducted from the compensation of Minnesota public employees and spent on political advocacy. I would ask for members' support, and I would request a roll call, Mr. Speaker.
Roll call having been requested. Are there 15 hands? Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. Discussion to the amendment. The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Mr. Speaker, Representative Garofalo, I'm not sure why you want the auditor to repeat an audit that they just did in July of 2013, but that's what your amendment to my amendment does. And members, of course, if you feel like the audit should be conducted again 2 years after it was last time, you should feel free to vote with Representative Garofalo on this. If you think that would be a waste of resources and the auditor's time could be better spent doing other things, then I would urge you to vote no. The Office of the Legislative Auditor conducted an evaluation report summary, or published it in July 2013, on state employee union fair share fee calculations. The only recommendation that Legislative Auditor Noble made was that the Bureau of Mediation Services should update its guidelines on chargeable union activities, and the Bureau of Mediation Services agreed that it would do so. The auditor did find that political activities from the funds of state employee unions are limited by federal law, and that the unions are complying with the limitations in federal law. And they took a particular in-depth review of AFSCME Council 5 in Education, Minnesota, and found that in fact they were fully compliant with the law and compliant with federal requirements as far as percentages of their dues that could go to political activities. And the relevant percentage is that 85% of the money from dues and fair share fees have to go to activities related to collective bargaining and representing employees. And in fact, all state employee unions were compliant with the 85% requirement. So if you want the auditor to check again, or maybe to see if the BMS updated its website, I'd feel free to vote with the Garofalo amendment. If you think that's a waste and a duplication, vote no.
Discussion on the amendment to the amendment. The clerk will take the roll. The clerk will close the roll. There being 74 ayes and 55 nays, the amendment to the amendment is adopted. There is an amendment at the desk to the amended amendment. The clerk will report the amendment to the amended amendment.
Winkler moves to amend the Winkler amendment as amended to Senate File 888, the unofficial engrossment as amended, and the amendment to the amendment is coded A50.
The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Winkler, to your amendment to the amended amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to request a roll call.
Roll call having been requested. Are there 15 hands? Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. Representative Winkler.
Now, Mr. Speaker, I did ask that you report this amendment to the amendment before the last one. And I guess if I was trying to make some kind of point about dark money versus unions and wanted to kind of get a gotcha vote, I'd probably have done what you just did, which was to put the Garofalo amendment first. And so after having had that debate about fair share fees and union dues and political activity, I'm sure everyone who supported that last amendment would think that the legislative auditor should in fact evaluate the influence of undisclosed campaign money in our elections and in this legislature. We have had no audit of that. We have no available information regarding dark money in our politics, except that we know that it's there. And we can infer, based on the evidence of the bills that we've seen you pass so far this session, we can infer that that money has a great deal of influence on the body that we all serve in. So members, I hope that you will support this amendment to have the legislative auditor actually evaluate this issue and do what we can to bring some small measure of public transparency to our campaign and election system. And I believe that based on some of the very strong work that the auditor has done recently at the University of Minnesota, Minsure, and other places where he has really been willing to go in and tell the truth, dig into the facts, and find out what's happening and who's doing what right and who's doing what wrong, I think we can all be satisfied that pursuing this dark money is a very able and worthy goal for the legislative auditor, and I would ask for a green vote.
Discussion to the amendment to the amended amendment. The lady from Hennepin, Chair Anderson S.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, members. Representative Winkler, in your language, it is rather vague. When you're talking about to evaluate the use of money to influence voters in political campaigns, it doesn't say any specific entity. So are we going to be asking the Office of the Legislative Auditor to do something that, quite frankly, is not possible for them to do? There are countless images that are presented before citizens that are designed to influence them politically, whether it's magazines, TV, and I'm talking about Hollywood TV shows, those that you see on the regular channels, those that you see on cable. You're going to be asking them to go through all of that kind of information because you don't have anything that is clearly stated that it's anything that is directly campaign related. And so social media, a whole host of things. So tell me, how much time is the Office of the Legislative Auditor going to be spending to review all of these materials and trying to interview? They're going to have a focus group just for citizens in the state of Minnesota to figure out exactly what you're watching, when you're watching, and what you see on every single day. That is frankly a waste of the Office of the Legislative Auditor's time. It's not feasible, and members, I encourage you to vote no.
Discussion to the amendment. The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Mr. Speaker, Representative Anderson, one suggestion could be that the new bureaucracy that you're creating at the legislature to serve yourselves, which is the so-called legislative fiscal notes, when that staff perhaps is not busy creating whatever numbers you want them to create for you, perhaps then they could take some time to evaluate the influence of dark money in elections. But I think you can also recognize that the auditor is more than capable of identifying the most egregious influences that are out there and searching out that information first. I doubt that he's going to be confused or kind of flummoxed somehow by the vagueness and uncertainty of this task. I think anybody with a bit of common sense understands that hidden, undisclosed money is influencing elections, and you generally go to where the dark money is first, I think, if you want to investigate that. Members, I'd ask for a green vote.
Discussion. Discussion to the amendment to the amended amendment. The clerk will take the roll. The clerk will close the roll. There being 57 ayes and 72 nays, the amendment to the amended amendment does not prevail. Now to the amendment as amended. Discussion. The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Mr. Speaker, this amendment was originally intended to actually serve some useful purpose to investigate and learn some more information, but the Garofalo amendment just creates duplicative work that the auditor has already done, so I would withdraw this amendment.
The amendment has been withdrawn. There is an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
McNamara moves to amend Senate File Number 888, the unofficial engrossment as amended. The amendment is coded A13.
The gentleman from Dakota, Chair McNamara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, you may have noticed Jess Mingo was around the last couple of days having you sign the telephone bill. We actually have a really antiquated system where you have to, everybody on the House has to sign their long-distance phone bill before the bill can be paid. This amendment does not change the obligation. You're still obligated if you use your phone for long-distance phone call for personal purposes. It just doesn't require the signature by every single member on their bill before the state can pay the bill. It has been a county nightmare for poor Mr. Mingo, and this amendment would take care of it. I believe it's Representative Kahn, myself, and Representative Loeffler are co-authoring the amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Discussion to the A13 amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? No. Motion prevails. There's an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Winkler moves to amend Senate File Number 888, the unofficial engrossment as amended, and the amendment is coded A21.
The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, we've been trying since the beginning of this legislative session to deal with the issue that we have big loopholes in campaign finance laws that allow money to be spent to elect or oppose candidates, money to go right before the election in unlimited amounts spent by nonprofit corporations in order to influence people's votes. They are it's the only type of campaign spending that is not required to be disclosed under Minnesota law. We have left this loophole open in statute, and it is time to close it. The kinds of loopholes that we are talking about include the definition of express advocacy and the definition of electioneering communications. What this bill does is to change the definition of express advocacy to be clear that you don't just need to say vote for or vote against in order to be sending out a piece of campaign literature that advocates for or against a person's election. We are also clarifying that electioneering communications includes information sent out to voters in a particular district identifying a candidate in that district in the 60 days before a general election and the 30 days before a primary election. It includes multiple exemptions for organizations wishing to communicate with their own members. It has exemptions for people sending out newsletters. It has exemptions for nonpartisan voter guides. The only kind of campaign spending that this targets is campaign spending to influence voters in a particular district by identifying a particular candidate in the run-up before an election. It is obviously and without question sent out for the purpose of influencing the electorate, and yet it is not required to be disclosed. This amendment would finally close that loophole, members, and we could finally have a little bit of a grip on the record amounts of dark money that are flooding into our elections. Members, I would ask for a roll call, and I would request a green vote.
A roll call having requested are the 15 hands. Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. Gentleman from Stearns, Representative O'Driscoll.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Representative Winkler's amendment looks very, very familiar to me because it's also House File 2015, which I authored. And I'm going to, Mr. Speaker, raise a point of order on this under Rule 4.03. This will violate our budget resolution for the state government finance bill that was passed in Ways and Means. As the author of this bill, I'm telling you that there are fiscal consequences in here, and by adopting the bill as presented as an amendment by Representative Winkler, it will in fact break our budget resolution. So, Mr. Speaker, advice to you to rule this amendment out of order.
Advice to the Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, advice.
The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Mr. Speaker, I can't ask Representative O'Driscoll to yield the floor to a question, but I wonder if Representative O'Driscoll ever requested a fiscal note on his bill. And we can have this discussion now on this bill. And Representative Driscoll, I think it's important for the body to understand that this bill is the bill of the Campaign Finance and Public Disclosure Board, the bipartisan board that's responsible for regulating and overseeing the integrity of our election finance system. This is their bill. This is not a partisan bill. This is their bill. You introduced it. I don't know if you requested a fiscal note or not, but a very similar bill that I introduced, House File 43, is a subsequent amendment to this. That bill did receive a fiscal note showing zero cost. Representative Anderson requested that. We've discussed that on the floor. So we can have this debate whether you think the Campaign Finance Board's own bill creates a fiscal note of more than zero for them, or we can just have a vote on your bill that you introduced and move on. But otherwise, we can go on to the next one if you'd like to. But I thought we'd give you the benefit of the doubt of having your own bill brought forward on the floor today, since you introduced it, and it does substantially what the House File 43 does that I introduced. The point is, it's a zero cost. The fiscal note would come back the same, and your point of order should not be well taken.
The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Nelson.
Advice, Mr. Speaker.
Advice. Mr.
Speaker, just like the state auditor or the legislative auditor, Nobles has often said when we give him additional tasks, Mr. Goldsmith has said that the cost of this is something he could absorb in his office, and there's no fiscal cost to it. That's what he said in the past. So I would take the not well intended.
Advice. The lady from Hennepin, Representative Anderson S.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I have the fiscal note for Representative Winkler's bill, which is very similar to this. And it's not that there wasn't a cost. There was a cost of $32,000. And actually, the O'Driscoll bill was done last year by Senator Rest. It showed a cost of $32,000 there as well. So there is a cost to this, Mr. Speaker, and I would rule that it's out of order, or ask you to rule it's out of order.
Further advice. The lady from Hennepin, Leader Pepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe it is out of order for the reasons stated, but I'd just like to offer additional advice, since this is probably the 6th, 7th, 10th time that we've seen language like this. And so I just want to point this out while I'm on this point of order, and that is that this language is actually unconstitutional, as Representative Winkler knows. The Supreme Court has ruled on it. I can direct you specifically to a couple of sections. One is the section on express advocacy. What Representative Winkler wants to do is he wants to change the words so that it says the language is susceptible to no reasonable interpretation other than as an appeal advocating the election or defeat of one or more clearly identified candidates. There's problems with that because the Supreme Court has already said in Buckley versus Vallejo that express words of advocacy of election or defeat have to include words such as vote for, elect, support, and cast your ballot. And that's what Representative Winkler does not want to put in his language, because he knows that the Supreme Court has already affirmed that. And the reason is simple. It's because it's a violation of the First Amendment. And the Supreme Court has said that vague words such as this, when someone's supposedly supposed to have no reasonable interpretation, is it's pretty unclear, and it's a violation of the First Amendment. So members, when we hear this, just so you know that this is clearly a violation under several Supreme Court cases. Another Iowa case was also decided with virtually the same language. So members, Mr. Speaker, I would ask you to take the point of order well taken, and if you don't, members, this is unconstitutional.
And members, I will not be making a ruling under the Constitution, but rather the House rules. The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Thiessen, Leader Thiessen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and that was wise. You're absolutely right about that, not to rely on the Constitution. You can't do that. But I think what the argument Representative Pepin is making, because it was the point of order was raised under 4.03, is that when there's a chance that a statute that's being passed into law is unconstitutional, that it violates the budget resolution. For instance, when we've seen many abortion pieces of legislation that come up before this body that are clearly unconstitutional. I think in the future, if you rule in favor of the O'Driscoll motion, what you're doing is setting very good precedent for us to rule all of those motions and amendments out of order in the future. So I appreciate Representative Pepin's argument to set some precedent on those grounds, and I would urge you to find the point of order not well taken.
Thank you. Further advice. Gentleman from Stearns, Representative O'Driscoll.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Additional advice. Just to fill in a few of the gaps, I used the expression earlier today, the Paul Harvey rest of the story. Well, Representative Winkler also has some additional rest of the story that he forgot or was maybe not pertinent to the conversation this evening. In 2013, when Representative Winkler introduced a bill similar to what I've introduced in House File 215, he brought it through. They found out that there was a fiscal consequence to it. It had to be re-referred to the Committee on State Government Finance, which it was successfully defeated at that point. And the following year, Representative Winkler brought a similar bill back, and the Finance Board said that there would be no cost to that. Again, I want to remind you, Mr. Speaker and members, that I have a similar bill, and I am telling you that there are fiscal consequences in here that are not taken into account in the budget resolution. So 403, Mr. Speaker.
Further advice? After reviewing House Rule 4.03 and members, I am basing my ruling on House Rule 4.03. After having listened to advice from several members, I find that the point of order is well taken.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to request an appeal of the ruling of the Speaker, and I'd like to offer advice to the body.
Representative Winkler appeals the ruling of the chair. Representative Winkler.
And Mr. Speaker, I'd like to request a roll call.
Roll call having requested. Are the 15 hands? Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Mr. Speaker, members, I would urge you not to listen to the misstatements from Representative Anderson S. regarding the fiscal note. Fortunately, the Speaker did not have the benefit of seeing the zero fiscal note. He only had the benefit of hearing what Representative Anderson S. had to say. What the fiscal note actually says is zero impact, general fund dash 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, all blank spaces. Zero fiscal impact on the general fund, zero impact on the budget target, zero impact on this bill. So, Mr. Speaker, I hate to request an overruling of your, appeal of your ruling. You didn't have the benefit of having the facts in front of you, and I don't blame you for trusting what Representative Anderson S. said on the floor. We would naturally trust what speakers on the floor, representatives say, but this actually says zero for House File 43. So we can go on to the next one if you want to, but a zero impact means zero. And you can't make it up, you can't manufacture it. I know you want to do that. That's why you create your extra bureaucracy of fiscal notes in the House. But you can't do it yet. You got to wait and to see if you can get that bill signed into law. Then you can make up your own numbers and have somebody else back it up. But for now, members, I would urge you to overrule the ruling of the Speaker based on the fact that there's a zero fiscal note. If anybody wants to come and look at it, I have it right here. 0, 0, 0, 0. No matter which, I look at it different directions, it still says 0. So I would urge you, members, to overrule the Speaker's ruling, and I think that's a red vote. And members, if Representative Anderson has something to disprove zero, she should share that with the body other than just her word.
Advice on the appeal. The lady from Hennepin, Chair Anderson S.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Winkler, what you failed to mention to everyone is that there is a cost to implementing this bill. There is a $32,000 cost in that fiscal note to do this bill. And that isn't just happening for this year. This happens in Senator Rest's bill for Senate File 643 of a cost of $32,000. And last year, when this bill came up, the Campaign Finance Board said they would not be able to absorb that cost. So you are adding a cost to the state that violates the budget resolution. And so, members, I ask that you uphold the ruling of the Speaker.
Discussion. The gentleman from Hennepin, Leader Thiessen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I would encourage people to overrule the ruling of the Speaker in this case. You know, we're talking about some very important issues here, but particularly this is important in the context of this bill, which blows the lids off campaign funding, that destroys democracy in this state. When you are going to pass a bill that is going to allow you to allow political candidates like us to spend as much as we want, no limits whatsoever, and raise all that money from our corporate PACs and lobbyists and friends, I see why you may want to do that. But that's what this bill does. And it takes the small voices, it takes the average person out of our political system. So I hope that you vote to override the ruling of the Speaker so we can at least do one thing in this bill that's going to allow us to bring up a small amount of reason and democracy back to the state of Minnesota. Once this bill is passed, all bets are off.
Discussion. The clerk will take the roll. Oh, excuse me, members, excuse me. The question before the body is, shall the decision of the Speaker stand as the judgment of the House? A yes or a green vote supports the ruling of the Speaker. A no or a red vote goes against the ruling of the Speaker. The clerk will take the roll. The clerk will close the roll. There being 76 ayes and 53 nays, it is the judgment of the House that the decision of the Speaker shall stand. There is an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Winkler moves to amend Senate File Number 888, the unofficial engrossment, as amended. The amendment is coded A24.
The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Winkler, to your amendment.
Mr. Speaker, members, this is a very similar provision to the O'Driscoll bill. This is House File 43, and I don't know anything about Senator Rest. I don't know anything about a last year fiscal note. All I know is that this one says 0, House File 43. This is the fiscal note Representative Anderson S. requested for this bill in her committee. This is the bill that she refused to hear, even though she requested the fiscal note. Members, this closes loopholes in campaign finance laws. It deserves a vote. The public deserves to know whether you're on their side or whether you only care about the people who bought your election. And if you want to hide from it yet again, I'm sure you'll find a way. And Mr. Speaker, I'm going to anticipate a point of order, but I'll wait to offer advice until that situation arises. Substantively, this is a very similar bill to the last amendment.
Discussion to the Winkler amendment. Discussion. Delay from Hennepin, Majority Leader Pepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I don't know that there is a point of order in this. I'm not sure. Maybe someone else has a point of order. Although after the lawsuit that the state will face if this were to become law, I think it would be a significant cost, but I'm not sure if there's a point of order for that. I'll let someone else look under that. But the reason I would ask members to vote against this is because, again, this has already been decided by the Supreme Court. There's a couple sections in here. There's the same express advocacy section in here where it says that that express advocacy has the meaning given in section blah, 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 also means any material that when taken as a whole and with limited reference to external events is not susceptible to any other interpretation by a reasonable person. And the Supreme Court has been very clear on that. There has to be magic words that say things like vote for or elect, things like that. And that's been held up for many years. So that is one unconstitutional problem with it. Again, it was tested again recently in Iowa, virtually the same language, and it was ruled against by the Supreme Court. And then secondly, on the first page, starting on section 1.3, where it talks about the dollar amount, and the Center for Competitive Politics has put out a statement on this. It was, I think, probably Representative Winkler to one of your past bills in past years. And it said that it's likely unconstitutional because A, generalized disclosures for electioneering communication, which is what is proposed in this bill, has never been upheld by the Supreme Court, and B, it is likely small organizations would have to obtain outside compliance assistance, and groups will stop their issue advocacy to protect the anonymity of their contributors. As the court noted in Citizens United, the First Amendment does not permit laws that force speakers to retain a campaign attorney before discussing the most salient issues of our day. So members, I mean, if you look at the case law, it's pretty clear on this. I think that trying to pass such a law and somehow thinking that it's going to be upheld in a Supreme Court is pretty silly. So I think that we should just vote it down today.
Discussion. The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Mr. Speaker, I'd just like to request a roll call, please.
Roll call having been requested. Are there 15 hands? Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. The gentleman from Hennepin. Any further discussion on the amendment? Gentleman from Hennepin.
Mr. Speaker, if there's no further discussion, I would just like to answer Representative Pepin's fairly outlandish constitutional interpretation and say that the courts have repeatedly said that disclosure is acceptable. In fact, Justice Stevens, poor Justice Stevens, that's an unfair thing to him to say. Justice Kennedy said in the Citizens United decision, which he wrote, that disclosure is constitutionally acceptable. The express advocacy language that we're using here has been upheld multiple times by federal courts in both the 8th Circuit and nationally. The point here is not that we're creating any kind of imposition on anybody's free speech rights. All we're requiring them to do is disclose when they're spending. And Mr. Speaker, I wonder if Representative Baker would yield to a question.
Representative Baker will yield. The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Baker, on January 29th, the first time I think we brought this up, you stated that you were going to be working with the chair of the Government Operations and Elections Committee and coming up with some legislation soon on campaign finance issues. And I did a quick check, and it looks like you've introduced 26 bills as a chief author related to various subjects, health and education, jobs, commerce, legacy, agriculture, all of those things. And I have not yet found a single bill that you've introduced related to campaign finance. So, Representative Baker, my question for you is, do you think that we need to do something to expose the undisclosed money that is influencing elections in Minnesota, or do you think that we should keep it quiet?
The gentleman from Candy, Ohio, Representative Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as Representative Winkler has mentioned, I do want to see some good things happening to making the voters appreciate our system of voting and how our campaign rules work better each year. Haven't found that yet. Everything I've brought up to Chair Sanders with the Election Committee is seeming to be sort of on that constitutional line of can we get this through or not. So we're trying to figure out something, and I plan on being here 2 years, so I want to make sure that I've got a little more time to work on that, Representative, so I hope to do some more later on. Thank you.
The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Baker, you've had a long time now. I know that anybody can claim to be a first-term member for the first year and a half, but you've had a long time. You've introduced 26 bills related to health and human services, education, energy, commerce, legacy. All of those things you've become an expert on pretty fast, and I congratulate you on that. But apparently, one of the top priorities that you announced for your constituents related to campaigning you have not yet found time to be an expert on. I hope that you have a chance to do that, maybe over the interim, and come back with some really strong legislation next session. I wonder if Representative Tice would yield to a question.
Representative Tice will yield. The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Representative Tice, as
excuse me. She's not on the floor at this point.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Please state your point of order.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to Section 124 of Mason's Manual, Personalities Not Permitted in Debate. Item 3 says it is not the person but the measure that is the subject of the debate. I see that Representative Winkler is doing his best to imitate Steve Ott today, and I just want it to be known that we need to keep it to the subject, not the people.
I'm going to defer ruling on the point of order at this time, but members, let's try to keep personalities out of the debate. Further discussion to the A24 amendment. The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think this letter from the NCCL was sent around by Representative Tice, and if she is indeed submitting this to the floor to influence our votes, I'd like to be able to ask her something about it. So I wonder if anybody else sent this out and it wasn't Representative Tice, please, indicate with an arm gesture or whatever kind of gesture you'd like, and I'll ask you. But otherwise, I'd rather have the time to talk to Representative Tice about this than she pass this around.
Representative Tice is not on the floor at this time. Any further discussion on the
Mr. Speaker, I would like
the gentleman from Hennepin?
I'd request a call of the House.
Okay, call of the House has been requested. Are there 10 hands? Seeing 10 hands, the clerk will take the roll. The clerk will close the roll. To the A24 amendment, the gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would Representative Tice yield to a question?
Representative Tice will yield. Representative Winkler.
Representative Tice, I think it looks like your signature on this letter from the NCCL related to this legislation. And typically, I think the MCCL focuses its efforts not so much on campaign and election issues, but on abortion and choice type issues. But for some reason, they seem very intent on weighing in on this debate. And since you passed this letter out, Representative Tice, and I guess want us to understand what they're saying, I wonder if you could explain how this bill is in any way vague or burdensome or regulates campaign issues that are not related to elections.
The lady from Stearns, Representative Tice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and Representative Winkler. I believe that the folks who donate to groups like the MCCL want their voice heard, and so that's what they contribute to. I do think that there are answers to be found, but I think we need a bipartisan answer, and this should go through the process. The Government Operations Committee in the interim will be looking for some of those solutions, but I don't believe that this bill at this time is the solution.
The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Mr. Speaker, would Representative Tice yield to a question?
Representative Tice will yield. The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Representative Tice, if you oppose this disclosure bill, I wonder if you could tell me what kind of disclosure bill you think would be better.
The lady from Stearns, Representative Tice.
Mr. Speaker.
For what purpose does the gentleman rise?
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Please
I rise under.
State your point of order.
Mr. Speaker, I rise under Mason sections 114, questioning another member, and I would direct the body to the subsection 6 in limitations of questions, which would does not allow us to ask another member of a question of how they intend to move forward. Representative Winkler is trying to tiptoe around that by saying, what would you say would be a good thing, which would be which would be directing Representative Tice to say how she's going to proceed or how the body should proceed with the question before the body. Representative Winkler knows that he needs to confine his questions to the question before the body, which he is not doing.
Advice, the gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Mr. Speaker, my advice is that you would not rule on the Dean point of order. I think I was very much well within the rules and the traditions of this body when I asked her, I asked Representative Tice not how she was going to vote. She announced that she was opposed to it, and I simply asked her what would be a better alternative. If we can't debate what would be a better alternative to a bill that's before us, we would really not have much debate. And I understand that sometimes members don't like to answer questions, they don't want to engage, but I didn't put Representative Tice into this debate, she did. And so I'm wondering what she thinks would be better, and I think that's well within the House rules, and I would just urge you not to rule on the point of order, and we can continue. And I'm well aware and mindful of how the institution works at this point.
Advice, the gentleman from Ramsey, Representative Lesh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The ship of bringing personalities in or intentions in to this debate has sailed earlier this evening on this same bill when Representative Anderson began asking individuals on this side of the aisle of what they pulled in for their campaigns and where they gave it. That door wasn't just opened, it was kicked in by Representative Anderson at this point. Representative Winkler has used kid gloves in dealing with other members on your side of the aisle compared to those direct questions. Therefore, because the door has been opened, Mr. Speaker, Representative Winkler is well within the bounds of the rules.
Further advice, the gentleman from Sherburne, Chair Knobloch.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, again, if you consult section 114, but this time subsection 5, not subsection 6, you'll see it says a question as to what course a member proposes to follow is not in order. Representative Winkler specifically asked Representative Tice, if you don't like this particular bill, what would you propose in order to get to a solution? He's specifically asking what course she would follow. Mr. Speaker, I'd urge you to find the point of order well taken.
I believe I'm being given advice on two different parts of Masons. Representative Dean, could you please restate your site in Masons?
Mr. Speaker, actually, Mr. Speaker, the entire section deals with limitation of debate, and I think that 2 points were brought up. Number one, that we are not on the question before the body, which would be subsection 4, and actually Representative Knobloch brings up another, which is a potential decision. But Representative Winkler has actually just said that he's tired of talking about this section of it, so he'd like to bring Representative Tice into another section. Representative Winkler's retractable leash is exceedingly long, and he tests the boundaries of that very skillfully on a daily basis. But he's actually told the body that he is outside of the section 4. He is trying to lead her into something that's not before the body, and that's not my advice. Actually, that's Representative Winkler's advice. He just said that.
The gentleman from Hennepin, Leader Thiessen, advice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, knowing you, Speaker Davids, I know you're going to rule this point of order not well taken because you like robust debate on the House floor. I know that that's very important to you. And what's going on here, is clear to anybody who's still watching at this point, and that is this, that you are afraid of having to answer these questions about dark money in politics, about the fact that you're blowing the cap off any spending limits, about the fact that you're going to let PACs and lobbyists fund your entire campaigns. That's what's going on here. Let's have the debate. Representative Winkler is not asking about the course she's going to take. He's asking, okay, if you don't like this idea, what's another idea? That's the essence of debate. How should we move forward on this? I mean, this is just, it's silly. It's silly. So, Speaker Davids, you should find this point of order not well taken, or you should defer ruling on this and let us get on with the actual debate about this bill. Let us get on with the actual debate about whether dark money in our politics is a good or bad thing, and if there are ideas to get it out, which Representative Baker and Representative Tice apparently think there might be, let's hear what those ideas are. And let's actually try to solve this problem, because I don't think the people of Minnesota appreciate the fact that we're going to be blowing the lid off campaign finance reform in this state, that we're going to get rid of all spending limits, that we're going to make sure that PACs and lobbyists can exclusively and solely fund our campaigns, that we want to address the problem of dark money. The people of Minnesota know this is a problem. For some reason, the people in this body don't understand that. So, Mr. Speaker, I would advise you to either I would actually advise you to not to defer ruling on this and to find this point of order not well taken, because this happens over and over and over again, and speakers continually defer ruling on this so the next time someone can get up. Let's set some precedent and actually find this point of order not well taken.
Thank you, Leader Thiessen. Members, after having listened to advice and the point of order from Representative Dean, Section 114, members, please look at the limitations on questions, especially the second half of 5 under Section 114. At this point, members, I am going to defer the ruling and we'll continue the debate, but please, I am going to be watching very closely and listening very closely to the questions, and we'll be looking at Section 114 on page 94, Item 5, the second half. The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would Representative Tice yield to a question?
She will yield. The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Tice, just to even step back further from a very safe strike zone, as former Speaker Zellers would have called it, I'm just going to ask you a more direct and simple question. House File 43, which is the subject of the A24 amendment, requires that people who spend money to elect candidates disclose who's paying for that campaign material. Do you think it's better to have secret money in campaigns disclosed, or do you think it's better to keep it secret?
Delay from Stearns, Representative Tice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and Representative Winkler. I believe all the money should be disclosed, and I think that's what the Government Operations Committee wants to do in the interim. So I look forward to that debate and trying to find a bipartisan answer so that all monies are up for grabs.
Gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Representative Tice, I eagerly look forward to finding out all of the policy direction that the Government Operations and Elections Committee is going to bring forward in the interim. I would note that they have the only hearing, I think, on any kind of legislation in this regard that they've heard has occurred because of a provision of the rules that gave them little choice but to do it other than to bring it to the floor for a vote. I wonder if Representative Cornish would yield to a question.
He will yield. The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Representative Cornish, you distributed this letter from the NRA, which says that this bill is unconstitutionally vague. It goes is unduly burdensome, complex, and would negatively impact grassroots issue advocacy. I wonder if you could share with the body why you believe any of these statements from the NRA are true.
The gentleman from Blue Earth, Chairman Cornish.
Actually, no, I wouldn't like to.
The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Mr. Speaker, I wonder if Representative Cornish would yield to a question.
Will Representative Cornish yield? Representative Cornish will not yield. The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Okay, Mr. Speaker, I wonder if Representative Bennett would yield to a question.
Will Representative Bennett yield? Representative Bennett will yield. The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Mr. Speaker, Representative Bennett, I'm sure you've received a copy of this letter from the NRA opposing this amendment, and I wonder if you have any basis for understanding why in any way this amendment would be unconstitutionally vague or would impact grassroots issue advocacy in any way.
The lady from Freeborn, Representative Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and Representative Winkler. I'll take this time actually to say that I believe transparency in donations, contributions is very important. But I also believe that the First Amendment is very important. And we've seen a number of instances in our country, and I'm sure in Minnesota as well, where somebody's campaign contribution has been revealed and they've been persecuted because of that, lost their jobs and so on. So I feel like we need to move this very carefully through the proper committee and using the proper resources and whatever methodology that should happen, and make sure that we're careful. And I think right now to pass this would be irresponsible because we need to very carefully balance our First Amendment rights of our citizens along with the transparency issues.
Gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Mr. Speaker, would Representative Bennett yield to a question?
Representative Bennett will yield. The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Mr. Speaker, Representative Bennett, you raised the specter of somebody being persecuted for their personal views or their personal donations, and you talked about that as a First Amendment right, which we would all agree that you have a First Amendment right to speak your mind. I think we would all agree that if you disagree with somebody, the answer is to speak back to them. And I wonder if having private citizens respond to free speech with more free speech is, in your view, a form of persecution.
The lady from Freeborn, Representative Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Winkler. I'm not exactly sure what you're asking me there, but I will say that part of the First Amendment means that you are able to speak without fear of retribution. And we know that happens. There's been instances in California where people have lost their jobs. So I'll just say again, I really think this is an important issue with transparency of campaign donations as well as First Amendment, and we really need to run it through the proper committee and get it vetted and make sure that we have a very balanced approach to this.
The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Bennett, it's pretty curious that a bill that's loaded up with stuff that never got hearings and was just sort of at the whim of the chair ends up in a bill. In fact, Representative Bennett, would you yield to a question?
Representative Bennett will yield. The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Representative Bennett, this bill contains provisions that repeal all limits on what PACs and lobbyists can contribute to you as a legislator in your re-election campaign, assuming that you were to run for re-election. Those bills never had a hearing in the Government Operations and Elections Committee. There was zero process, there was zero vetting, there was zero thought. Representative Bennett, the question I have for you is, if this bill should be properly heard in committee, do you think it's a good idea for us to return this bill back to the Government Operations Committee for a hearing on the provisions related to the public subsidy and special source limits?
The lady from Freeborn, Representative Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Winkler, I'll just state again, I believe transparency and contributions is important, but I want to see this go through the committee. This is a vague amendment that you have here. We need to be very careful as we move forward. So again, it's an important issue, but so is free speech.
The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Bennett, I won't ask you to yield again, except I think if you actually looked at the bill and at the amendment, you would find that it isn't vague at all. It's very precise and specific to the way in which you have to disclose money that you're spending just before an election in order to elect or defeat a candidate. And Representative Bennett, you of course didn't answer my question about whether this bill should be re-referred to the Government Operations Committee for that careful balancing and thought that you talked about, even though the provisions that completely gut some of the strongest anti-corruption bill laws in the country never went through that committee at all. So I think it sounds to me like members on the other side want to distribute materials. Representative Cornish, I kind of thought you would have a little bit more guts than that. You distribute a letter from the NRA. You like to call people gun grabbers if they oppose any of your bills related to firearms. But when you distribute their letter on this issue, you don't want to engage in the debate at all. And then you leave it to Representative Bennett to try to answer some basic questions about it. I think that's not exactly admirable behavior from a senior member who knows something about this issue and is more than happy to distribute it on the floor. Now I see that you're engaged, Representative Cornish, so I wonder if you would yield to a question.
I think he will. The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Mr. Speaker, Representative Cornish, I'm sure you're going to use this opportunity to upbraid me for what I just said, but I wonder if in the course of the expected comments that you're going to make, you could explain in any way how this amendment is unconstitutionally vague or would somehow impinge on the ability of grassroots organizations to conduct their work.
Gentleman from Blue Earth, Chairman Cornish.
Mr. Speaker and members, actually I'm just going to engage you to say that you've been pretty friendly this year in the session on the committee, and I'm going to gauge you with respect, what you haven't done with the rest of the body tonight. And I think you're a bright guy and you can read the letters before you and it gives you the reasons, and I'm not going to dignify your insulting comments to me with the same, and I'll just let you read the letter and go for it. So, and that's about it.
The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Mr. Speaker, is there anybody of the many opponents, Representative Pepin, would you yield to a question?
She will yield. The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Representative Pepin, can you explain in any way how this is unconstitutionally vague?
The lady from Hennepin, Majority Leader Pepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and Representative Winkler. Yes, I can explain. Well, actually, if I could ask you, what does on line 2.3 and 2.4, what does it is not susceptible to any other interpretation by a reasonable person other than that is in advocating the election or defeat of one or more clearly identified candidates? What does that mean?
Leader Pepin.
Precisely, please.
Leader Pepin, Representative Winkler has the floor, and he asked you to yield for a question. I can put you on the list down here to ask him a question, but Representative Winkler asked the question of you, if you could please respond to the question. And now with a question.
Mr. Speaker, would Representative Winkler yield to that question?
Representative Winkler has the floor.
Okay, well then, Representative Winkler doesn't want to discuss this now because I can explain exactly why this is unconstitutional, which I've already clarified before. And you know, there's a couple things, Representative Winkler, in the section starting with 1.23, it talks about the $5,000. It doesn't explain whether it is as an individual or whether it is from the association. Furthermore, in the section that you don't want to answer, it talks about including the proximate, it says expressly advocates, that has the meaning given, blah, blah, blah. It also means any material that when taken as a whole, not sure what that means, it's vague, and with limited reference to external events, I don't know what that means. What are external events? In fact, if I could yield, I would probably ask maybe Representative Lean or somebody what external events meant, including the proximity to the election. I don't know how many days that is because it's not clear in here, vague, is not susceptible to any other interpretation by a reasonable person other than that as advocating the election or defeat of one or more identified candidates. And, you know, Representative Winkler, I'm really disappointed you're doing this. And earlier you impugned my motives, and you talked about, and you also mentioned that it was, my interpretation was wildly inaccurate. Representative Winkler, on March 31st, 2014, the Center for Competitive Politics sent you a letter on your bill, and it said precisely what I just mentioned, and you know it because it was addressed to you. It says, it talked about your bill, which was virtually the same as this language, and it said, various sections of the bill are unconstitutionally vague. The bill regulates an expansive amount of speech, including books and websites. The bill disclosures provides go farther than any form of disclosure approved by the U.S. Supreme Court. Goes on, it says the modified definition of expressly advocating is vague, and a similar definition adopted in Iowa was declared unconstitutional by the United States Court of Appeals for the 8th Circuit District, which covers Minnesota. Further, it says the United States Supreme Court's decision in the Seminole Cam Finance case of Buckley versus Vallejo famously limited the speech that could trigger political committee status under federal law to express words of advocacy of election or defeat, such as vote for, elect, support, cast your ballot. And that's what I mean by vague. Nowhere in this does it describe how one determines whether or not there's express advocacy, because nowhere does it require it to say vote for, elect, support, cast your vote for. Those are the magic words that were required in the Vallejo case. It hasn't been overturned. It was reaffirmed in the appeals court for the 8th Circuit, which had a very, very similar Iowa law, which had the language said reasonable minds could not differ as to whether it encourages actions to elect or defeat one or more clearly identified candidates. The proposed new additional definition of expressly advocating reads as follows, gave the same definition and clarified that is, again, unconstitutional. This is a ridiculous discussion. You received this letter. I've got it right here, addressed to you, Representative Winkler, from the Center for Competitive Politics. So bullying members or trying to run around and ask them questions about what language is vague is ridiculous. It's clear as day in the letter that you got. You know that these words in this amendment are unconstitutional or violations of the First Amendment, and it's ridiculous. So thank you. I'm happy to yield to any more questions you may have.
Gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Mr. Speaker, I think that Representative Pepin wanted to talk about a section of the bill regarding the definition of expressly advocates, and of course I would have been happy to talk about it if you had had the floor and were actually able to ask me a question. The language in sections 2.1 through lines 2.1 through 2.5 has been the same language that's in federal law and upheld multiple times. And a very simple illustration will tell you what it means. If you send out a postcard that says, vote for Representative Pepin because she is a really smart lawyer and majority leader of the House, that you have to disclose. If you send out a postcard that says that Representative Winkler is a mean, terrible, bad person who doesn't deserve to be in the legislature and therefore is a bad legislator and shouldn't have any opportunity to serve again, that would not have to be disclosed, because it didn't have the magic words vote for or vote against. Now, anybody can understand And you may even believe it's accurate. Sometimes I'm sure my family does. That some postcard that came out that said that I was a bad person who didn't deserve to be reelected. Anybody can understand that if you send that out 30 days before an election, it's for the purpose of defeating me. That's what that language means. That's the language from federal law. It's the language that's been upheld multiple times. Now, your letter from the Center for Competitive Politics is the same people who fund your campaigns. So the same corporate special interests that fund your campaigns and spend all the dark money have created another nonprofit corporation to do research and advocacy and write letters to me that says that this stuff is unconstitutional, but there's no foundation for it whatsoever. There's nothing in this that is in any way unconstitutionally vague. There is nothing in here that in any way impinges on the ability of a grassroots organization to advocate on issues or to talk to their members or do any of those other things. The only thing this bill does, that's in this amendment, the only thing that it does is require that you say who is paying when you are trying to get somebody in office or out of office. It's the same system that everybody else follows. For some reason, two organizations in Minnesota have decided that they don't want to follow the same rules that everybody else follows, that the MCCL and the NRA deserve special treatment because somehow they like to communicate this way and they're afraid of this so-called persecution, this notion, this kind of quaint notion that if you're willing to say something, you're going to have to be willing to have people know who you are, that you're going to go into the public square and actually own up to what you have to say. If the NRA wants to fearmonger on issues, if the MCCL wants to distort issues, they are free to do so under the First Amendment. This bill does not in any way limit their First Amendment rights to do those things. All this bill requires is that you actually have to disclose who is paying for it. And we're not talking about somebody who's paying $100 a year or $10 a month to join. These are limits, or I'm sorry, there are contributions of at least $5,000. Under current law, it would be $5,000, and it has to be a certain percentage of the total amount of political money they're spending. These are the big donors. These are the big money people who use nonprofit corporations to shield their influence, and they use the nonprofit corporation to shield their influence because they don't want anybody to know who's paying for politics. Now, Representative Bennett, you think that's a form of persecution for people to actually stand up and acknowledge what they're saying? For people to stand up and be willing to own their opinions? I don't think that's persecution. I think that's called the First Amendment. If you're not prepared for somebody to argue back to you, if you're not prepared to answer questions, if you're not prepared to engage in discussion in the public square, you're not really prepared to be in politics at all. This bill is a disclosure bill, but defeating this bill is a bill to cover up for cowards. It's a way to cover up for corruption. It's a way to cover up who's buying our democracy, who's undermining our economy, and who's selling the public downriver. Members, I would urge a green vote.
Representative Pepin. The gentleman from Sherburne, Representative Knobloch.
Mr. Speaker, would Representative Winkler yield?
The gentleman from Hennepin will yield. The gentleman from Sherburne, Representative Knobloch.
Well, Mr. Speaker, Representative Winkler, while I've been listening to your speech here, I've been looking at what happened the last 2 years. As you know, I wasn't here the last 2 years, and I noticed there's a House File 1944 that you are the chief author of that was introduced on February 25th, 2014. And if I look through it, much of the language seems to be very similar, if not identical, to the A24 amendment. And I'm wondering, Representative Winkler, if this is such an important issue that you feel so passionately about and your side feels so passionately about, why was it never brought to the floor of the House for a vote?
The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Mr. Speaker, the reason it was never brought to the floor for a vote, Representative Knobloch, was because of the influence of secret money and special interest deals that these letters represent. The MCCL and the NRA.
Members, please.
I mean, when I'm actually funny, I appreciate the laugh, but that wasn't actually funny. Representative Knobloch, it isn't a partisan issue. That's what I said from the beginning. You've used this kind of same line over and over again about how you weren't here and it's all a mystery and how did it happen, etc. But the point is, it didn't pass the last 2 years for the same reason it's not going to pass now. Because two organizations don't want to own up to what they're spending in our elections. They have influence among Democrats. They have influence among Republicans. That's the nature of influence in politics. It's not just partisan. It reaches out across multiple people. I'm one member. Many people support this. Some people don't. But the point is, if you don't believe in disclosure, vote no. If you believe the public has a basic right to know about how you got here, Representative Knobloch, about the hundreds of thousands of dollars that were spent on your behalf to get you here, to return you back to the House, to return you back to being the chair of Ways and Means. If you don't think that the voters in your district deserve to know that, then vote no. It's a simple issue.
Gentleman from Sherburne, Chairman Knobloch.
Well, Mr. Speaker, actually, I was outspent by $40,000 or $50,000 in my election by other interests that were not supportive of me. But all right, Representative Winkler, I guess you say that you were trying to bring this thing forward and you just couldn't get it to come forward. You couldn't bring it to the floor of the House because of all these special interests being against you. I'm wondering, Mr. Speaker, would Representative Thiessen yield?
The gentleman from Hennepin, Leader Thiessen.
Well, Representative Thiessen, again, I wasn't here the last 2 years, and I wasn't spending all my time watching what was going on the floor of the House. You were Speaker of the House. I'm wondering if you could enlighten us on why Representative Winkler's bill didn't get to the floor of the House for a vote.
The gentleman from Hennepin, Leader Thiessen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Representative Knobloch, right now we have a chance to actually act on this bill. You now are here, thank God, or not, I don't know, to inform us about all this information that you've been telling us all session long. And you now have the chance to either choose to get the dark money out of our politics or not. That's all that's in play in this debate today. That's all that's an issue in this debate. I imagine that you're going to vote to keep dark money in politics, that you're going to vote, and it's not just, you know, the MCCL and the NRA. There's lots of other organizations that fall into this category that spent lots of money in the elections in the last time around and spent money on both sides of the aisle. There's no question about that. That's why this is not a partisan issue. The fact is we should get that money out of our politics. That's all Representative Winkler is trying to do. And I also imagine you're going to vote for a bill that's going to allow you, who's probably one of the wealthiest people in this body. I guess you didn't abide by the spending limits last time, did you? I guess you didn't. You spent a ton of your own money to elect yourself, and that's fine. That's certainly constitutional, and you can do that. But what this bill will now allow you to do is not have to spend your own money to do it, but to raise unlimited money from PACs and lobbyists. And as chair of the Ways and Means Committee, you know, it's actually interesting. There was that letter, right, that Representative Knobloch sent, if I recall, to a number of lobbyists saying you donated some money. I see you donated some money to Zach Dorholt. Maybe you should rethink that because it's likely I'm going to become the Ways and Means Chair if we take back the majority. So, Mr. and Mrs. Lobbyists, you ought to send some money to me as well. I think you wrote a letter like that, if I recall correctly. So, Representative Knobloch, this is your chance actually to take that kind of money out of politics, and let's have a fair playing field, a fighting chance for members of the legislature, and more importantly, not members of the legislature, member of the public, to actually engage in our politics in a meaningful fashion.
Well, Mr. Speaker, you know, one of the things that has changed in the years I've been gone is some of the comments that are made on the House floor. And I'm not going to respond to some of the things that Representative Thiessen said. I will tell people that if you want to look at my campaign report, I loaned my campaign a whopping $6,000 at the end of the campaign, which is no small amount of money, but it hardly compares at all to the nearly $1 million that was spent in total in my particular race. But Representative Thiessen, you didn't answer my question. Representative Winkler talked about how he had brought this forward, how he wanted to bring it forward last year, how there were various special interests that apparently conspired to keep it from getting a vote on the House floor. And you, sir, were Speaker of the House. You had the ability to bring this to a vote, and for whatever reason, we never got a vote on it. So members, I'm not going to say any more about it. I guess we're all going to be able to have our votes. Members, This issue has been before the House in the last 2 years. Somehow or other, it never found its way to the floor of the House for a vote. Perhaps it was because people feel like Representative Bennett does and Representative Pepin does and others who have spoken do, that it is unconstitutional. And so therefore, perhaps that's the way Representative Thiessen feels, that it's unconstitutional, and so it shouldn't have come to the floor for a vote. And if that's the case, I can appreciate that that might be a position that he might have, and that might be a reason for not bringing it forward. But members, this has been an issue that's been here before, and despite all of Representative Winkler's debate on it, he had his chance last year when the Democrats were in the majority. Somehow or other, it never got its way to the floor for a vote. So when you think about all the other issues involved, other union money, for example, that's not covered by this amendment, the free speech issues that are here, members, I guess there's a lot of other issues here to think about.
Representative Considine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm rising in support of the amendment. I think, like a lot of you, I did a survey to find out what the people back home thought were pressing issues. It was pretty simple. There were 6 questions. 5 of the questions, the answers were all over the board, so I know that I had Libertarians, Republicans, Democrats answering this. However, question 5, should outside special interest groups that can spend unlimited amounts of money in elections on independent mailings and ads be required to disclose the total amount of the spending and the major donors behind it? That was over 95%. In 120 surveys, I had 5 people that said no. And actually one of those said no, but then underneath it wrote, "Stop Citizens United." So I think that person was actually confused. I am a little bit confused about one other thing, and maybe it's something that I missed, but I could have swore about the 2nd or 3rd day we were here, Representative Winkler did try to bring this to the floor and was shot down. So if we were going to start the process like several people have said they want to do, wouldn't that have been a good time to do it? Thank you.
Representative Drazkowski.
I pass, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Isaacson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I really have enjoyed this debate, and one of my favorite parts of this debate has been the GOP logic that because you perceived to fail to do the right thing last time, now we don't have to do the right thing now. That's probably my favorite message and takeaway from you guys so far in this debate. You know, I think all of us get wrapped up in this whole concept of politics and being on both sides, and when we get angry or we get frustrated or we think of ourselves as partisans, and then we get on the floor and we have these debates, and when we walk back and forth between the House and here, or SOB in here, we actually have real conversations and find out about our kids and our lives, and it turns out, you know, contrary to popular opinion, you're not all bad people. Contrary to popular opinion, neither are we. Politicians in general are real people who have real lives, who have families and kids, and they're involved in their community. And I think that one of the things that I struggled with the most in the last election was watching the lit pieces rain on my house and rain on my district, sometimes up to 3 a day. And what I really struggled with was the moment my wife said to me, "You know what? I'm just not going to check the mail anymore because I am tired of reading the garbage that they're saying about you." And I know that every one of you over there that had a targeted race experienced the same thing I did. You've experienced that moment of frustration when somebody put out 10,000 pieces of mail that said something about you that you just know is not true. It just isn't true. But how do you respond to that? What do you do to respond to that? Well, one option is just to lift the caps and let us raise as much as we want so I can fire back as much as I want, right? The other option is we can have some sensible regulation on how we manage these elections and making sure people are held accountable for the things that they say. Now, I'm a public official now. I've been elected. I've had that experience. And maybe you over there you're thinking, well, Jason, you should have a thicker skin than that. Or the argument could be is maybe we don't have to be so mean to each other. And maybe we don't have to be so dishonest with each other just to win an election. And so when I read what this amendment is trying to accomplish, and I think about the bills that we have, right, and I think about the lit pieces that are coming out, I am personally offended by that. And I get even more offended when I see people like Representative Knobloch stand up and so disingenuously try to defend that side. You and I both know that literature that comes out isn't always accurate, and we're in no way able to respond to that by the current costs. And you know what? If I have the willingness to stand up and put myself in the public light, and I'm willing to say, here I am, flaws and good characteristics, I want to run for this office, I'm trying to step out and take some responsibility for leadership in our state and try to make things better. And then somebody can come along and donate a ton of money undercover to say things about me that aren't true in hopes of winning this seat for the other side so they can vote for a different speaker, and you guys sit over there and say that's not something we should take care of? Are you kidding me? That's embarrassing. This is why people hate politics. This is exactly why. And the fact that we sit here divided like this, angry as we are as our leadership dig their heels in, and we're unwilling to make a simple vote to make this better is disgusting. And I find it to be very frustrating. I'm frustrated because I have all those lit pieces at home right now. And those lit pieces that talk about who sent them and what part of it is known and unknown. But I have lit pieces of what they said and the calls I had to take every day. Now, as much as you want to demonize, as those lit pieces did, that we're some sort of phony politicians up here making some big choices on our own that are so self-aggrandizing, we make $31,000 a year. And we're not legally allowed to accept anything. So you know what? We're not being self-aggrandizing. And that is disingenuous, and this amendment helps us put a stop to that by making it clear that if you're going to donate to people that don't tell the truth, we're going to know who you are. And it is your First Amendment right to say what you want, and you also get to be held accountable for it. So I'm very disappointed when I hear this kind of red herring argument all over the place and unwillingness to answer this question because you've been backed into a corner by your leadership instead of taking a stand because you have an election certificate. And that's what you should be doing right now.
Any further discussion on the Winkler amendment? Seeing no further discussion, the clerk will take the roll on the amendment. The House is under call, members. Please vote. Clerk will close the roll. There being 51 ayes and 78 nays, the motion does not prevail and the amendment is not adopted. There is an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Winkler moves to amend Senate File Number 888, the unofficial engrossment as amended. The amendment is coded A52.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Winkler, to explain your amendment.
Mr. Speaker, members, this is a very simple amendment. I would ask for a roll call.
A roll call has been requested. Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call.
Mr. Speaker, the House Rules Committee has announced its intentions and I think maybe acted on a House budget that requires $2.96 million in reductions in compensation to our staff. This amendment clarifies that if this legislation, if Representative Anderson S.'s bill leads to a reduction in the House budget, the amount of those reductions should be shared evenly between members and staff rather than having a 25% increase in housing and other goodies for members while cutting compensation to our hardworking staff. We should share the pain evenly. And, you know, we can debate later, I suppose, about whether it's a good idea to cut staff in the middle of a budget surplus time when they've been doing a lot of hard work over the years to get us to this point. But to the extent that we are cutting, we should be cutting evenly between members and staff instead of serving ourselves first.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Representative Winkler, actually what our bill does is it's a 7% increase over what we passed in session law from 2011. So we are spending 7% more than what we spent in the 2011 session funding for the legislature. But that being said, members, I encourage you to vote green on this.
Any further discussion on the amendment? The member from Hennepin, Representative Thiessen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure why we're comparing with 2011. I think there was a session in between 2011 and the current session. And I thought, Representative Anderson, that you actually had a cut target. And it's clear from the budget page that there is a 5% reduction. So that's a really weird argument.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Anderson.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker and Representative Thiessen. You guys increased spending for the legislature, your own spending, by 10% in the 2013 session, on top of creating a Senate office building that you have no way of paying for. So those were some of the little nuggets that you left us to deal with for this year.
Any further discussion on the amendment? Representative Uruso.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I urge a green vote on this. I think when we have a little nugget like a $1.9 billion surplus, 2.9, excuse me, is getting very late. I think we can find room to compensate our staff, and there shouldn't be any need whatsoever to make cuts to them.
Any further discussion on the amendment? Seeing none, the clerk will take the roll on the amendment. The House is under call. Members, please vote. The clerk will close the roll. There being 129 ayes and 0 nays, the motion prevails and the amendment is adopted. There is an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Lilly moves to amend Senate File Number 888, the unofficial engrossment as amended, and the amendment is coded A18.
The member from Ramsey, Representative Lilly, to explain your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I'm always leery to follow Representative Winkler. He's quite a talented orator. But and I was a little confused by the last argument on the last amendment. But anyways, my amendment here is regards to the across-the-board cuts that the House is seeing, the 5%. Amendment 18 restores a reduction to the House budget and just the impact to our staff. And the way I do it is I go after the capital moving expenses, and I think about my years in college, and we were able to move ourselves. So I'm kind of thinking maybe the senators might even have some friends that they might be able to, you know, I don't know. They have twice the districts we do, so maybe they might have enough friends that could help them move across the street or wherever they're moving to. I suppose I'm not supposed to bring up all that, but when I was thinking about this amendment, you know, you guys can, you know, I kind of went through. I was thinking about retirement speeches and all that because you know, we've continually had Representative Knobloch say, you know, I wasn't here. So I thought, you know, I should go look at speeches. You ever do that? It's kind of fun. So I started with his speech. And he had a wonderful speech. And one thing you guys do that I always like, you guys do ties better than we do. And he had a wonderful tie. You know, Representative Hackbarth and Representative Cornish, you guys honestly do have cool ties. But or Representative Erdl, I don't want to leave him out, my buddy. But that day you had a beautiful tie, red, white, and blue, screaming tie. It was like, you probably could see it at the Senate building. So, so you were talking and how much of an honor it was, you know, and to serve your district, which we're all going to say. I was never involved with freshman training, so one of the advice I would do is take a look at your speech and what you're going to say at the end of your term. You'll learn a lot. But what he said is what an honor it is to serve St. Cloud and Stearns County and the history that your great family has in that area. You thanked your wife, and I learned a lot about you with your pretty neat kids, and they were here sitting right there in that row. And he was pretty funny. He said, you know, I'm getting a little stale, he said. I don't know if I could read any more of these bills. Remember that? I think that's pretty funny. He must have been one of these guys. There was a couple that read every bill, and I remember Oba Miller, I sat with him over there, read every bill front to back. And Congressman, whatever, Emmer, no, not whatever, Congressman Emmer read every bill cover to cover. I hate to admit publicly that I don't read every bill cover to cover. Hopefully nobody's listening. But you thanked, in your speech, you thanked Shirley. You thanked your staff. You thanked her for a couple things. You thanked her for maybe adding a few pounds to you with those marvelous cookies. But you thanked her. Then I kind of got going on this. It kind of is a little addictive to listen to these speeches. And so I got into last year, and I started watching Mary Liz Holberg. She sat over there in the bullpen. Or bull, what do you guys call yourself? The dog pound. And I think and she called herself a name. We're not going to say what it was, but she was amazingly bright, and she's missed. I mean, clearly we see that on some of the bills here that we're doing this year. She was caring. She's funny. She tells a story about the first time she met, I suppose I can't turn around here, but she sat next to Representative Davids. And they sat next to, I think over by where Representative Hackbarth sits is kind of how I read it to be. And they sat next to each other on the floor. The first thing he says to her, he says, according to her, he says, don't touch my desk. And don't touch my papers. And by the end of it, they're stealing candy. I think he's eaten a few candies, and I do. We share candy here in this row. But she had advice that day, and we all should listen to it. You know, we're all going to fight, and that was kind of talked about here. We're all fighting. But at the end of the day, don't punch too hard, because tomorrow you're going to be working together on something. So that's pretty good advice. So you learn a lot of this advice from it. But she said, love this place. And then she got into about the people behind the scenes. And she looked up at these people and others. And she said, we broke every single labor law in the state. She just said that 2 years ago. A lot of you guys are new, and I respect that, and you know, whatever. And we have new members too, but I hope my members are listening as well. They care as much as we do about what we're doing, she said. This is the best institution, and we should keep it that way. That's Representative Liz Holberg. Ron Abrams, 17 years, he thanks his LA. Can you imagine one person working for someone 17 years? House Research, he thanked. Fiscal staff. love this body. What an honor to serve. That's how we're all going to be measured at the end of the day, is when we get up here. We're going to give our little speech. I'm practicing. Other people make us look good, Ron Abrams said. Thank the staff. Representative Beard sat right back here. I liked him because he was an aviation guy. I like planes. But anyways, he got up. He was part of this. I forgot about it. He talked about the old guy caucus. He says, maybe we should wrap it up at about 10 o'clock, 11. So, treat our staff and have them go home. I've got a whole big list. Some of them are our people. I thought it was interesting with what we've been talking about the last couple of days. Keith Ellenson talked in his. He said he thanked a lot of folks for going up to the north side. He even I thought that was pretty neat. He mentioned the ball of twine. I don't know if I would have mentioned that in my retirement speech. I don't know where Representative Erdahl is. I thought he'd enjoy that. Last year, Representative Drazkowski and I, through the last couple of years, and then Representative Benson, we always did battle on the state contract bills. And I can't tell you how much, actually I learned a lot, especially from Representative Drazkowski. I did every time he asked a question there was on the bills. But Benson talked about the great staff, amazing staff. And he's talked about when he first came here, it's like drinking through a fire hose. He talked about Joe Marble. He's part of your team. We had a freshman that got up a couple today, and he had staff that were helping him, and I was in that position. Nobody's helping me now. I wish they were. But Joe Marble. And then at the end he goes, I'm leaving, but Joe's going to be here. And I've seen some of you folks. Joe will hand you a sheet of paper, and then you'll get up, and he's staff. Zellers. I don't know if you remember him, Mr. Speaker of the vote. Someone saying voting. Okay. I liked his thing. He said, never let the Senate win. Right? Remember that when you were in this body? Never let the Senate win as we're coming up here. He talked about a couple of facts about members. Of course, he was proud to be from North Dakota. He loved Minnesota, so he always said, I'm from North Dakota. A couple facts about members we all know. Representative Gruenhagen was on the school board for 16 years. Gentleman next to me, what was he? Chair of Education. He talked about that. But then he got into staff, his own, back offices, pages, writers, and of course, the front desk. And then he talked about that day when we had the restart. You guys, a lot of new people probably don't remember that. And Al Mathowitz, he talked to him, he says, holy buckets. And then Al said, no, we can't do that. And then Speaker Zellers kind of restarted, which was good for our institution that I feel that he did that. We're blessed here with a staff. So it breaks me a little bit on our heart that we would consider even doing this. I've had some amazing people on your team that have come up to me and said, we're not going to do this in the end. It's just kind of a position. We're going to, it'll be different. And I just wish we wouldn't, it's just not right to do it. I mean, we have a surplus. I just don't think, we have a big myth that someone talked earlier today about some myths about the politicians making all this money. Our staff are not getting rich. I work for a big company. They give a big bonus when things got better. Our staff aren't going to get a bonus. And then we do this to them. I know one staff member told me the other day, or earlier today, he says, nobody knows, but we're here till like 11 o'clock. And that same day, he had 3 teeth pulled. And he's up there all day. We're lucky. We get to take a break. We go watch hockey, which I did. I think we're winning 4-1 or 4-1. So we get a break. They're up here. They run out and they run back. But it's not just them. It's all over. We shouldn't talk about our staff like that they're not part of our family. They're not part of our team. I think we're better than that. We need to treat people well, hire good people, and I guess that's that.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Pepin.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House be allowed to meet past midnight.
Representative Pepin moves that the House be allowed to meet past midnight. Any discussion on the motion? Hearing none, all those in
Mr.
favor?
Speaker?
Representative Lilly.
I would like a roll call, and thank you, sir. My mistake. I think I'm okay with passing on the roll call on the Majority Leader's amendment.
Thank you, Representative Lilly. All those in favor of the motion to meet past midnight signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. The motion prevails. Any further discussion on the motion, or on the amendment? Representative Lilly.
Mr. Speaker, and thank you. I would like a roll call, please, on the amendment, and would like your support, please.
Roll call has been requested on the A18 amendment. Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. Representative Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And members, I urge you to vote no.
Representative Schoen.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I just want to rise in support of Representative Lilly. I think one of the most disgusting things about this is to talk to some of our staff that are trying to feed their families on their salaries, and then we're cutting it. They're trying to feed their families, their children, and they need food assistance on the salary that we pay them now. And like Representative Mary Liz Holberg, the good-hearted woman that she is, pointed out very clearly, be good to our staff. That's what she was saying. There isn't a single person that didn't shake their head over there and went, you know what, our staff is fantastic. They put in the extra hours. They're the ones who make us look good. They're the ones who help us get reelected. This is ridiculous what we're doing to our staff. It's sad, and you know it. Support our staff.
Further discussion on the amendment. The member from Ramsey, Representative Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. After such a rough recession in Minnesota, when I had the good honor of being the Majority Leader and Chair of Rules Committee, I was so happy that we were able to balance the budget and to make sure that we were able to give the staff of the Minnesota House a raise, a well-deserved raise. It was really satisfying because they do work so hard here. And I'd been a staffer once over in the Senate. It was hard work, and I think the people that work in the House are phenomenal. And I think they work a lot harder than the people do in the Senate, but that's just me because I like the House. And so I was surprised when the Rules Committee made this decision to cut the staff salary. I was really surprised by it, especially because we've got such a nice surplus. And while it is a significant cut to the people who work here, it doesn't really save the state that much money. So I thought maybe, because you in your targets created such a significant tax cut number that you were struggling to get to that number, and you had to really look under every cushion and find every pot of money. And so when I saw Representative Lilly's amendment tonight, I was really excited because he worked hard, I think, to find a way to find the money to get you guys out of that jam that you were, created for yourselves, unfortunately, by the targets that you set. But I didn't think really if someone found a way for you that you would choose to sacrifice their staff and their salary, not if somebody found a way. And Representative Lilly in his amendment found a way for you to be able to make that work so that you could be clear in your support for our staff, just like we were 2 years ago. And so, Representative Anderson, I'm wondering if you would yield.
She will yield. Representative
Thank you, Mr.
Murphy.
Chair. Representative Anderson, you are so crystal clear in your opposition to Representative Lilly's amendment. And, he's come up with a good idea, but you didn't really give us much of a rationale. So I am wondering why you are so eager to cut our staff's salary.
Representative Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Representative Murphy, for the question. What I saw over the last 2 years is a situation where you are building a building that we can see from the windows right out here and you have no way of paying for it as of today. You passed that back in 2013, and you have no idea of how you're going to pay for that bill or that building over there. And so we've had to make some tough choices here, Representative Murphy, because you could not figure out how to pay for that bill over there. And instead, what we are doing is we are making the citizens of Minnesota pay $137 million for that building over there that you have no way of paying for. In fact, we are paying more for that building because of the way you tried to put it through, which we don't even have a bill. There was no bill that was before the legislature. The House never saw a single bill that was brought forward. This thing just kind of appeared out of nowhere. It's like the great unicorn of the legislature. So I find it hard to hear from you to have such concern when you left that albatross across the street, wrapped around our necks, and wrapped around the necks of every Minnesotan in the state. $137 million that you did not fund. Not one dime.
Representative Murphy.
Well, thank you, Speaker Dowd and Representative Anderson. You know, I'm glad for your revisiting of that, but that dog's not going to keep hunting for you, because especially now that you're in charge, you know, you're going to be responsible for the budget going forward, and you have some responsibility for exactly what you're describing. But rather than spend any more time talking about that, because I know you like to wave that shiny object and say, oh, the building, let's not talk about what you're really doing. A $2 billion tax cut is your top priority, and the large share of that is going to corporate special interests. And you are funding that by cutting our staff. And let me say, while we're having this debate, Majority Leader Pepin moved to meet past midnight, meaning partisan staff and nonpartisan staff and the clerk's office. We are here till midnight and beyond, and we will be back here again tomorrow morning, as they always do, and they will be ready to work and to serve the people of Minnesota. A $2 billion tax cut. You are sacrificing our staff for corporate special interests. And you want to talk about a building? You want to talk about a building. The people that work here do it because they love Minnesota, just like those of us who serve here love Minnesota. They don't earn much of a living. And you are going to cut them so you can fund a $2 billion tax cut. That's disgusting.
Representative Pepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. We've heard some really interesting conversations, and I agree we do have fantastic staff. But I do have, I guess, a rhetorical question to ask, and that is, if you respect our staff so much and wondering why you're tweeting about our staff currently, and I would ask also, and want to point out that several times, at least two, in Rules Committee and on the House floor, Minority Leader Thiessen has specifically called out our executive director and made some interesting accusations and aligned his alliance. And so I just want to point that out. There's no point of order I'm making, and I'm not yielding to a question. I'm just saying that let's keep in mind, if we're going to talk about staff, you make some really good points about our fantastic staff, but let's not call out specific staff people on the floor in committee anymore.
Representative Davids.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I'd just like to correct something that my good friend Representative Murphy E. stated, saying that most of the money in the proposed $2 billion tax cut goes to special interest corporations and so forth. Actually, there's a fact check done on that. I made the comment that over 75% of the $2 billion goes to individuals. And of course, that was facts checked. I don't know why they check my facts. I mean, I'm always right. So over 75% goes to individuals. So, and then of the 50%, of the 25% that's left, quite a bit of that goes to very, very small businesses in Main Street, Minnesota. So just wanted to correct the record there. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Considine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of the amendment. I kind of like to walk around and talk to the staff in between. Was talking to, well, if you guys know my LA Joan, she doesn't have any kids at home, I don't believe, but was talking to one of the LAs. She is a single mother, and with what she's getting paid for here, she qualifies for food stamps. So I'm definitely in favor of the motion, or the amendment. Thank you.
Representative Simonson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members, and Representative Lilly. I want to say thank you for bringing this amendment forward. Your comments tonight were spot on, as usual. But I'm looking at your amendment, Representative Lilly, and I wonder if, Mr. Speaker, I wonder if Representative Lilly will yield to a question.
He will yield. Representative Simonson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Lilly, now you're a pretty smart guy. I know you. And there's a lot of numbers here on your amendment. But I'm just wondering if you could tell me and tell the body, you know, what the difference is between what's being proposed in Chair Anderson's bill and what you're proposing to spend on staff. If you could just, you know, even in round numbers, give me an idea what it is we're talking about that you would like to spend on the good quality staff that we have here.
Representative Lilly.
Mr. Speaker and Representative Simonson, and I actually do not have a magic number that I'm thinking of. I just really firmly believe that you hire good people and you treat them well, because I think this is part of our team. They love Minnesota. They love us in this institution. So I actually don't have a magic number, because, you know, every job will be different, and every work, you know, is measured as it should be. I just think you hire good people and you treat them well.
Representative Simonson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Representative Lilly. And, you know, I appreciate your honest answer. But in reality, members, we're talking about a drop in the bucket. We're talking about less than a couple of $1 million to maintain the salary that our staff earns, which is not a high salary to begin with. And I think it's a little disingenuous if we're going to try to blame our staff for the Senate office building. Really. Like somehow it's their fault. Like any of them had anything to do with the construction of the Senate office building. No. Mr. Speaker, will Chair Anderson S. yield to a question?
She will. Representative Simonson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Anderson, a question for you. And you and I sit on the tax committee together, so I'm sure that you'll have some sense of what the answer to this question is. But I'm wondering if you can tell me, in the Omnibus tax bill that I think passed out of Ways and Means today, if you remember off the top of your head and just, you know, round it off to the nearest $100 million, what the proposed tax cut to the CI is in the next biennium, commercial industrial. If you could just give, you know, round it as close as you can.
Representative Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Simonson, I do not have that number off the top of my head, but what I can tell you is that you own this. You own this entire thing, because right across the street, you can't avoid it, is that Senate office building that you have no means of paying for. On top of it, Representative Simonson, you voted to allow for the governor to increase pay for his commissioners by $30,000 or more, up to $84,000. And you didn't seem to be too concerned about the House staff at that time, did you? So don't come to me when you can't even pay for that building across the street. In fact, your entire budget was unsustainable, and now we are having to come here and fix that mess across the street.
Representative Simonson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Chair Anderson, for not being able to answer the question. You know, you can say all you want to me about the Senate office building, and I'll own my percentage of it. Okay? Everybody in Minnesota is going to own a piece of all the government buildings. I'm good with that. You can say whatever you want to say, because we all know the truth, right? I mean, this Capitol needs to be renovated. That's reality. That needs to happen. The Senate needs to go somewhere. That was the most efficient and least expensive option in front of the Rules Committee. Every one of you knows that, but you twist it around, and I'm not here to talk about that. But Mr. Speaker, will Representative Davids yield to a question?
He will yield. Representative Simonson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and Chair Davids. Question for you, because I'm just guessing that you probably know exactly what's in the omnibus tax bill. And if you could just tell me what the CI tax cut is in the next biennium in your omnibus tax bill.
Representative Davids.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and Representative Simonson. I'm going to go, well, I can't go over to Representative Drazkowski. Maybe you could ask that to Representative Drazkowski. That's in his division report. He should have a better number than I have, and I'll try and look it up on my spreadsheets here.
Representative Simonson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Chair Davids. Will Representative Drazkowski yield to a question?
He will yield. Representative Simonson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and Representative Drazkowski. Chair Drazkowski, could you tell me what the proposed cut to the CI tax is in the next biennium?
Representative Drazkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Representative Simonson. In the House tax bill that you're going to see coming forward, and as we did in the division report, we are going to relieve Minnesota businesses, and especially Minnesota small businesses all across this state, of about $445 million of tax burden that the state is placing onto them in the form of a property tax. And that, Representative Simonson, if you'll remember, is yet on top of all of the local property taxes that each and every one of those small businesses, whether you're talking about the lady in Aiken, Minnesota that we heard about last week who had to put in an extra 400 pies a year just to pay her statewide business property tax, or you're talking about people in Stewartville that we heard from that have empty lots, commercial lots that they can no longer even afford to pay the property taxes on, to a wide variety of other businesses around our state that are struggling in the face of a large state bureaucracy that continues to slow them down in their ability to grow their business, to reach the American dream, to hire people, to do the good things that businesses do in this state. Those are the things that we will see happen as you see the great things unleashed in the House Republican tax bill that will come before us next week. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Simonson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Chair Drazkowski. And you're actually pretty close on the first biennium in terms of the large tax cut to the commercial industrial tax base here in the state of Minnesota. But Mr. Speaker, I'm wondering if Representative Lincheski will yield to a question.
She will yield. Representative Simonson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Lincheski, you are the DFL lead on the tax committee, and I know that you sat in on the property tax division as well. And I'm just wondering if you could shed some light on perhaps what Chair Drazkowski was referencing in terms of the tax cut to the CI tax base, and he seems to be suggesting that this is going to have some magical impact on just individual property tax payers across the state of Minnesota. I'm just wondering if you could maybe shed some light on that, and then take it one step further and talk about what the cost of this tax cut is out into the future, perhaps.
Representative Lincheski.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Representative Simonson. And of course, this isn't my bill, but I can shed some light on it. And the price tag for the commercial industrial property tax you're talking about, while it shows up in the first biennium as about $638 million, and the second biennium as another 600, that's not the true cost. It's not being booked in its full cost because it's being phased in over multiple years. So it's actually going to create a deficit in Minnesota if something doesn't change. That provision alone, the true cost of it is $1.7 billion in tax cuts for corporations in the next biennium, but the bill is only phasing it in over time. So through a unique kind of accounting, people are able to make it work on a spreadsheet that technically fits the target for the tax committee, but in fact would ensure a deficit for Minnesota. That tax cut, Representative Simonson, and I was looking at the fact check, and actually the GOP tax bill earned a misleading for the claim as to that the majority of relief is going to the middle class. You have to look at the full cost, and there are some middle class tax cuts, but it's short term and it's small. But there's large corporate tax cuts to infinity, I guess, and beyond. So that provision isn't really paid for. We'll spend a lot of time talking about that down the road. But members, that tax cut for corporations will cost Minnesotans $5 billion in lost revenue over the forecast window.
Just as a reminder, members, we are on the Lilly amendment, the A18 amendment, which has to do with the state government finance bill. Representative Simonson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate your latitude. And thank you, Representative Winchesky, for shedding some light on that. And members, you know, I'm going to wrap this up with my point here. And Representative Lilly, again, thank you for this amendment. And I think during the short discussion that we've had here, we've learned that you're proposing to spend, shift back about $2 million that would allow us not to cut the salaries of our staff. $2 million in comparison to the hundreds of millions of dollars in corporate tax breaks. And we can argue, right, about whether those are directed towards corporations and large businesses, or whether they're perhaps, some of those dollars are shifted onto individual property taxpayers. But the reality is, if you compare hundreds of millions of dollars in tax cuts versus $2 million to take care of our staff, big difference. Thank you.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Thiessen.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And first, I would like to acknowledge a point that Representative Pepin made, and she's absolutely right. I should not talk about our staff on the floor and committee, and I apologize to Mr. Golnick for doing that, and I won't do it again, because she is right about that. But members, we've had a lot of discussion about this amendment, and there's been a lot of talk this session about family budgets, and that we need to budget like we're budgeting for a family budgets. But when we look at some of the things that are going on, whether it's cuts to wages of tipped workers, whether it's a refusal to take up the Working Parents Act, or most specifically and most importantly right now, whether it's cuts to the budgets, the family budgets of our staff, we're not living up to those words. When we cut the budgets of our staff in a time of surplus, we're not living up to our highest ideal, I guess, of making sure we're watching out for family budgets. Because when you cut those budgets, you're cutting family budgets. Our staff have families. So members, I hope that we can adopt this amendment. I look forward to going into rules tomorrow or Monday and readjusting the budget, because we have adopted a budget in rules. The Republicans adopted a budget in rules, I guess, that did cut staff significantly. And with the last amendment that went on, we're going to have to go back in and recalibrate that budget to make sure that we're at least equally sharing as members of this body with those cuts. So I look forward to having that discussion in the Rules Committee. I hope that we can focus on our staff. I do need to say there has been a lot of talk about what happened in the last several years and what we did. And what we did is leave this state with a $1.8 billion surplus. What we did was invest over $500 million in education. We brought all-day kindergarten to the state of Minnesota. We made the first meaningful investment in early childhood education. We froze tuition in this state. We made sure that we were investing in broadband in the state in a meaningful way and started down that path. We made sure that we invested in economic development programs. We made sure that more people got health insurance and coverage in this state in an affordable way. Those are the things that were accomplished over the last 2 years. And we were able to find money, even in a time of deficit, to actually increase the pay of our staff. Representative Anderson, in her opening comments, criticized us for raising the pay of our staff. That, I think, is unacceptable, members. And what we're doing in this budget bill by cutting the pay of our staff is also unacceptable. So I hope that we vote for this amendment so that we can restore some money. I look forward in the Rules Committee to balancing out the cuts between ourselves and our staff, if this is the direction we need to go. Because we should be focused on family budgets, but we should be focused on the family budgets of real people, the people we work with. And so Mr. Speaker, I ask that people vote yes.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I'll just be brief. This is about real people. The real people of Minnesota don't expect to see that their surplus tax dollars are going to be spent on pay raises for governors' appointees or on a $137 million building across the street that wasn't needed. This could have been avoided. Vote no.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Hortman. The member from Ramsey, Representative Lilly.
Mr. Speaker and members, I think we're about there. This is about our team. No one's getting rich. They miss what you and I miss. This is your staff too. I know who's getting married. I visit with you in the back. It's not just our team, it's all of our team. Take care of our team. Don't just do it in your speech at the end when you're done.
Any further discussion? Seeing none, the clerk will take the roll on the amendment. The House is under call, members. Please vote. The clerk will close the roll. There being 57 ayes and 72 nays, the motion does not prevail and the amendment is not adopted. There is an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Khan moves to amend Senate File Number 888, the unofficial engrossment, as amended, and the amendment is coded A36.
Representative Pepin.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the call of the House be lifted.
Representative Pepin moves that the call of the House be lifted. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The motion prevails. Representative Khan, to introduce your amendment.
Mr. Speaker and members, I'll have to point out there's a little mistake in printing. The amendment is also co-authored by Davids and Nash. What this is tries to correct one of the mistakes that was made a couple of years ago, actually not in the House. I think the House had corrected it, but it was still messed up when it got to the Senate. What this does is at some point we took out the MNsure technology was taken out of the agency that specifically understands technology, i.e. the agency now called Minute. This not only puts it back in, but specifically says that this will never be done for any other agency in the future. And I'd like to yield to Representative Nash at this point.
The member from Carver, Representative Nash. He will yield.
Mr. Speaker, Representative Khan, thank you for the opportunity to work with you bipartisanly because Minute will help MNsure. It's a big insurance issue for Minnesotans, and I am glad to have worked with you to correct the problem that, as you pointed out, was not made in this body, it was made in the Senate, and I urge members to vote green.
Representative Khan.
That's good enough, isn't it?
Any further discussion on the amendment? Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor of adoption of the Khan amendment signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The motion prevails and the amendment is adopted. There are no amendments at the desk. The clerk will give the bill its third reading.
Third reading, Senate File Number 888, as amended.
Third reading. Further discussion on Senate File 888. The member from Hennepin, Representative Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. In looking at this bill, I'm not so sure it's a great bill. Matter of fact, I have some concerns about some of the way in which the new proposed soccer stadium is indicated in the bill, and I would ask folks to vote against it. And I also would hope that we think about what we do for other facilities throughout the region that are large employers and large contributors, and that hopefully moving forward that the small requests that has come from the partnership is something that hopefully we all can consider and hopefully we'll be able to vote for in the future. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I urge a red vote on this bill. Send it back to committee, make us do a better job with it. This bill is nothing but more shifts, more cuts, more gimmicks, and some micromanagement that we really haven't talked much about in the bill tonight. You know, as we go about it, we hear a lot of talk about local control, but in many portions of this bill, we're taking local control away from people and getting it back to the legislature and making us make all the little decisions that go along the way. We hear discussions on this floor about we should run government or government more like a business. But we're, again, putting more decisions back here to us where we don't have the front line know what's going on. Be like a CEO of 3M going around to every office and counting the paper clips and the rubber bands. And we shouldn't be doing that as a legislature. We shift, or I'll call it steal, money from the money paid by our employees of the state of Minnesota, including ourselves, into the health insurance fund that we're self-insured fund, and we're paying that money in to pay medical bills, and we're going to steal that money out to help balance our budget and pay for a one-time cost to pay for a program that's an ongoing program. And again, that's not something we should be doing, especially when we have a surplus. Like I said earlier in my remarks, sometimes some of these things you have to do when we're in deficit to try and maintain programs and get them going and get us over the hump for when things are going to be better. Well, things are better now. We've had 10 years of deficits. We've had 2 years of surplus here, and now we're going to make more cuts like we're in deficit all over again and go back to the same shifts and gimmicks that kicking the can down the road and making future legislatures and future taxpayers pay for the stuff we're doing today instead of paying our bills right now like we're doing it. So members, the hour's late, and I could go on a little bit here, but this is a bad bill. And remember, there's a lot of things in here that I don't see getting past conference, and I don't see getting, if it gets past conference, I don't see getting past the guy in the corner office. So members, vote red on this bill.
The member from Ramsey, Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Budget shifts, gimmicks, sleight of hand, those are the best descriptions, as my colleague here, Representative Nelson, said. And the cuts in this shifts and so on are so poorly thought out, I have no idea what the goal is with respect to this bill. Some of the things that really jump out at me in terms of problems are one, the bill reduces the planned contribution to the Public Employees Retirement Association by $36 million. This is a huge thing for para folks. We learned that the fund will meet its obligations and have an extra $36 million available because of improved actuarial assumptions. But instead of sharing that extra money with the people who paid it in, Minneapolis teachers, city employees, airport workers, and so on, the money is used for your budget. Secondly, it transfers over $7 million from legislative reserve here at the House into the general fund for your use. And of course, it eliminates public financing of state campaigns, as we've heard tonight for quite a while, and takes the money that was left unused into the general fund, another sleight of hand. And it transfers thousands of dollars from the public employee insurance program to help fund the ethnic councils for one biennium. And the biggest sleight of hand, and I think Representative Nelson referred to this, is that it transfers $10 million from the state government employees insurance group to prop up the ethnic councils, the veterans homes, and revisor of statutes. And as we heard in testimony in committee, this is not a surplus rainy day fund. This is actual money that the Labor and Management Committee work on to ensure that that program, that health insurance program, stays whole. As I said, there doesn't appear to be any strategic plan or goal in mind when looking at the cuts at our state agencies. The agencies weren't brought in. They weren't brought in to get some idea of how these cuts could be put into place or what the impact might be, how they could plan for it. None of that occurred within the committee that we were in. And the bill lays out some arbitrary plans, one of which is to limit the number of state employees to 36,211. That seems to be an arbitrary number taken from 2014. Why, I'm not entirely sure. But what happens, folks, when we have emergencies like we do with the avian flu, for example, and we need folks to help out with situations with problems like that? Are we supposed to just not hire the people? Are we supposed to take them from other agencies? It's not clear. Not clear at all. And there's large cuts to our great workers throughout the state, whether it's in Minnesota management and budget or administration. We're a very lean state government. Quite frankly, we rank 37th per capita in terms of state employees. And at a time when we have a $2 billion budget and decide to cut state workers even more, it just seems ridiculous. We heard about the cut to the State House of $3 million. I don't know what else you can say about that other than we have a responsibility to treat these folks in a way they should be treated, and if you're going to be the party of the middle class, there's nothing more middle class than the workers that we have here at the Capitol. One of the frustrating things about the bill is at the same time these cuts are being made, more mandates and responsibilities are being put on the state workers. An example being one of the state departments, one of the departments in the state where you're cutting 16 employees at the same time you're requiring more work that entails 28 new job responsibilities. And again, that doesn't make any sense. Cutting and making more responsibilities to get done. So what we have is more work with less staff, no overall strategic plan at all, just arbitrary cuts, and add in the elimination of public financing and the end of spending limits, and boy, you have one heck of a bad bill. So this will be an easy no vote for you folks, and other than that, it's getting time to go home.
Any further discussion on the bill? The member from Hennepin, Representative Anderson.
Thank you, members. This bill is a good bill. We were dealt with a building over there that has no means of being paid for by the majority that left it to us. We were able to protect our veterans. I know it was earlier mentioned that there was cuts to veterans. There are no cuts to veterans in this bill. In fact, we prioritize state spending. What we do is we make sure that we're taking care of folks so that they can have better options when it comes to healthy eating. We make sure that we have helping our teachers teach financial literacy in our schools. We also make sure that kids that are at risk are getting the skills to help them read, something that's very important to their academic success. On top of that, we recognize the fact that when it comes down to real reform, as the governor wants us to do, we need to be the ones in state government to lead in that charge. And that's what this bill does. This bill puts in place better oversight of the public tax dollars that are entrusted to us. We have seen countless articles throughout this year of areas where a state grant has been given and the money's been abused. Investigations have happened, and it's really frustrating for the public. It makes them have a lack of confidence in all of us here at the Capitol. We need to restore that confidence. We need to have greater oversight, and that's what this bill does. Many of you talked about how you wanted to focus on the real people. This does focus on the real people of Minnesota, the people that pay the bill, the taxpayers of Minnesota. I think you get in this little fishbowl and you forget about that a little bit. This bill will help us right-size state government, get us back on track, and make sure the people of Minnesota have the confidence that we're spending their tax dollars wisely. I do want to thank Representative Thiessen on his work in the Pension Commission, recommending the $37 million for the MERV fund. That's something that the actuarial report put out. I appreciate his efforts on that. We took that and put that as part of this bill. But I also want to highlight a couple of other things for oversight and whatnot that we need to address. We talked about the public subsidy program that's part of this bill. And nobody in the state of Minnesota is asking that their tax dollars go to some candidate that is then going to turn around right away and send it over to their party. They don't want to see their tax dollars being used in a public subsidy so somebody can go buy some food maybe for some volunteers. That's not what they're expecting. This bill still puts in place the disclosure requirements that we have. You still have to report what you're going to do. But what it says is you don't need to have the money in order to do it. Members, I also put in place an FTE freeze. Not a huge freeze by any means. I looked at the FTE trends from 2008 all the way up to 2014. That number was around 35,000. In my bill, I put it at 36,000 in 2011. We did some adjustments later on. But it was the number that I chose, wasn't actually what the average was in FTEs. I went back to 2014. So if you're concerned that this is going to burn the house down, then you should have been concerned about what FTEs that you had just last year. I think it was the third quarter, actually. So we're talking maybe 6 months ago. You're saying that that wasn't enough? The governor is going to increase FTEs under his budget proposal by over 1,500 people. Folks, we need to slow down things. Minnesotans have been footing the bill for a long time, and they can't afford it anymore. This bill streamlines things, makes sure they're right on track, and it restores confidence in the taxpayers. Please vote green.
Seeing no further discussion, the clerk will take the roll on the bill. The clerk will close the roll. There being 73 ayes and 55 nays, the bill is passed as amended and its title agreed to.